Chapter 1, Census at Dawn. By the time Janelle, Harper reached the 5th floor nurse's station, the sun was in that thin winter mood where it brightens paper, but not people. The hospital smelled like limon plastic and heat from vents that had learned to say central. 5 West was awake in the way wards wake. 1 TV murmuring cartoons from behind a curtain, 2 infusion pumps harmonizing in tired thirds, phones deciding whether to ring. On the whiteboard, someone had written the census in a practice block hand, 23/28. Beneath it, last night's charge nurse had left the usual jokes a decent shift leaves for the next. Do not feed pharmacy, and a smiley with a mask drawn over it. And then something not usual, a line with no name beside the heading nights. Charge. Blank as a wound dress too soon. You're early, said Odelia from behind the monitor bank, eyebrows already set to scold. Odelia had a lanyard full of pins and the cheerful brutality of women who keep wards alive. She handed Jay a folded report sheet and didn't let go for a second. You see this? Jay tugged once. The sheet didn't give, because it wasn't the thing that mattered. Odelia nodded toward the break room. 2 pots of coffee, both fresh, filters sitting like caps on the counter. No mugs in the sink. Fridge is full of Tupperware label night shift potluck. Help yourself, and all of it's empty and washed. Patients are tucked like somebody loves them. Lamps off. Vitals clean at 4. Look at the whiteboard. No names. Bad handoff, Jay said. The way people name whether they hate. New travelers? That's the other thing. Odelia leaned back and tapped the staff directory open on her screen. HR portal is missing last night's names from the schedule. Missing like they were never assigned. I called down to staffing. They said we ran skeleton crew, and we should be grateful. The elevator chimed and coughed up 2 day shift CNAs and a phlebotomist who moved like someone braced to apologize in 3 directions. Lab runner's late, the phleb said by way of hello. But we've got a rack full of overnight sticks in the chute, all time-stamped 3:12 to 3:45. Who drew them, I don't know. Our list says deferred. The tubes say otherwise. Jay tucked the report sheet under the keyboard and did the most ordinary thing she knew. She made a loop. 8 rooms down, 6 back, the little S-curves nurses teach their bodies without a seminar. Room 512 had the day's light learning the window. Mr. Kenji lay with his eyes open and the careful stillness of men who hate to be caught sleeping when something medical needs to be said. Morning, she said, pulling back his curtain an inch because the sun is a way to tell the truth gently. Pain. Like a dog that wants to be let out, he said. That kid nurse came at 4. The one with the raven tattoo on her wrist. She sang while she flushed the line. You people don't get paid to sing. We don't, Jay said, because he liked it when she matched his dryness. She glanced at the 4 pump, noted the bag was fresh, the spike new. The chart showed the 4 a.m. med pass signed with 3 initials she didn't recognize. A flourish H, maybe an AG. Paper wrappers went in a bin because evidence is just garbage with a job. In the bin, 2 tegaderm backings, a needle cap, a corner of tape with a hair stuck to it, black and fine and curved perfectly around the word sterile. Room 515, Mrs. Alvarez, cheeks rosy from good oxygen, a plastic clamshell labeled heparin on her tray. The tall one drew labs, she said. Left-handed. Nice voice. White hair. Name? Jay asked, because you ask even when you know the room won't give you a present. She said to call her Knight, so we would remember what she was for, Mrs. Alvarez said, pleased with the poetry. Room 518 had the smell of oranges because someone had skinned one and the rind was in the trash under foam cups. The urimeter at the end of the bed showed someone had emptied it at 2. The flow sheet said, where it should have said RN. Back at the station, Odelia had started a pile of wrong. Pyxis, med cabinet. Reconciliations lay in a neat stack, each with initials that meant nothing to anyone on the ward. The machine's report showed a gap. Connectivity outage 19 to 7 o'clock. But the NARC count matched. Every vial accounted for, every signature signed with the same 3 letters, the same slanted hand, invisible to the database. So they clocked in, Jay said, or they didn't. They passed meds, or they didn't. They documented or they didn't, and we're the crazy ones. Security says their side is clean. No badge swipes on West between 1900 and 0700, Odelia said. Which is funny, because the fire door at the end of the hall has scuff marks at the hinge like it practiced opening and closing all night. The intercom announced morning huddle in Conference B, cheerful like a substitute teacher. Jay followed the float of bodies down the hall. Charge nurses, unit clerks, a respiratory therapist rolling a cart like a stubborn animal. Conference B had the morale posters and the old analog clock that ran 2 minutes slow. The nursing supervisor had a face like a closing argument. We had a vendor issue with the time system, she began. Chronosync didn't push last night's punches to payroll. HR is on it. Do not email payroll. Staffing reports skeleton crews overnight. Be mindful of safety and take care of each other. Remember, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Something in Jay's back went stiff. She had learned enough to make peace with bureaucracies that were more weather than law, but she had no patience for sentences that made liars out of blankets, tucked with love. We have labs drawn, meds passed, linens changed, pain scales plotted in handwriting that isn't ours, she said into the polite room. Your skeleton crew had 4 skeletons with excellent penmanship. The supervisor made the face she made when someone had brought her a dog and called it evidence. IT reports an electronic health record latency event, she said, as if rearranging nouns until they behaved was a kind of care. There may have been shadow charting cued and then purged. Like ghosts, said someone in respiratory who was trying for levity and missed hatefully. Like a cache, the supervisor said, because we are a hospital and not a haunted paperback. She glanced at the man from IT standing against the back wall like an apology on legs. He was a narrow thing with a badge that said K, Magelborn, Clinical Systems, and a beard he hadn't decided how to narrate yet. We did a generator test at 0100, he said, clearing his throat like a minor prophet. Load transfer to bypass. Back again at 0126. The EHR saw a split brain for a hot second. We do not expect data loss. We also had some interface queue backlog. He made the last phrase look like he might enjoy being corrected. Backlog, Odelia said, like blood work that got stuck in a pipe until it fell out of your mouth. Lab results are populating, Magelborn said, checking a phone that hated him. ADT messages are caught up. If you see orders that look negative, call the help desk. We'll call the help desk, the respiratory therapist said cheerfully. And they will say, have you tried logging out and back in, brother? The room dispersed because rooms have jobs. Jay did what you do when the top of the house behaves like a weather vane while the ground is deciding whether to give way. She went to the lockers. Nurse lockers smell like powdered coffee entombed in cotton. The night cruise bank, rows G through K, held the exact number of shoes a human shift requires.
No persis, no lunch sacks.
A single paper thumbtack, bent. In locker J, 12, a sticker peeled halfway off. Property of night, 3 north. This was 5 west. Jay pressed it back with a pat of her thumb, because the only thing more pathetic than a sticker trying to stay is a nurse pretending the glue has anything to say about reality. She found Cam in security, because she always did. Cameron Solano had been a Marine, a bouncer, a dad twice over, and one of the few men in the building who could stand in a doorway without making it feel like a threat. He sat in front of a wall of monitors that rendered the hospital in sick TV. The feeds showed hallways pretending they had not been lived in. He didn't turn when she came. He never made women waste calories proving they existed. You got anything that looks like people, she said. Some, he said. Door alarms at 208, 213, 217 on the west stairwell. No motion on the landing camera between 158 and 339 because the encoder decided it was wilted. I got a linen cart moving 12 inches over a tile and nobody pushing it. I got a light go on at 311 and 517 and off at 328. I got the elevator arriving on 5 at 303 with nobody in it. I got the nurse call board logging 6 acknowledged, events between 2:30 and 3:10 with the user field null. You, patient with a raven tattoo on his nurse, Jay said. Another with a left-handed phlebotomist who sings. Meds given by initials that do not belong to anybody I can make a staffing office remember. Cam rubbed his jaw with a thumb. We ran a night shift, he said. And then somebody went into the ledger and ate it. The clock above the monitors ticked impolitely. It said 9:33 and meant the clotted half hour, where the morning rounds hand you a list of small wrongs and demand tria. The radio on Cam's belt gossiped quietly about a family in the ED whose grief was rehearsing for theater. Jay stood with him a full minute because sometimes that is what keeps the building from falling into the river. Two people refusing to hustle at the wrong moment. When she went back to the floor, the whiteboard had been rewritten. Census 24/28. A direct admit had arrived from dialysis with a blanket that insisted on being folded twice before it would be forgiven. The new resident, eyes too awake, tie grimly hopeful, hovered in the hall looking for directions. "Where's Knight's notes?" he asked, and when Odelia handed him the flow sheets, he frowned at the initials and said, "Who is SG?" "Pick a saint," Odelia said. At lunch, Jay sat in the corner of the break room by the window and ate the crusts of someone else's lasagna because hunger is not sentimental. On the counter sat a ceramic mug with a chipped lip, the word night in block letters, and a lipstick mark that was not any of the staff on 5 West or 4. She turned the mug and read the joke on the back. "This shift never ends." She washed it because that is how you keep rooms decent when your brain is preparing for court. She texted Bree. BRE Khosravi ran health information like some women run choirs. She had a pencil behind her ear, an unassailable sense of pitch, and made the word compliance sound like a lullaby. She met Jay on the mezzanine where paper goes to be reborn as shredded confetti. "If this is about missing documentation," Bree said, "I am already 3 cappuccinos deep in rage." "It's more interesting," Jay said. "I want to know whether a person can exist in the EHR for 8 hours and then become air." "Yes," Bree said, too quickly and then at Jay's face. "Not legally. Interface engine hiccups will write shadows. There are internal user IDs with an N at the end for night batch processes, Harper J, N, like a draft of you the system uses to apply orders when it can't assign to the real you. Those are supposed to clear. I saw 3 charts this morning with notes attached to draft IDs with no author present. And then they fell off. On the audit log, there's a storm of reads between 2 o'clock and 3:30. You don't want to know which process name. It's the file watcher for the generator. Someone at facilities is about to be forced to learn the word middleware. "Show me the shadow," Jay said. Bree set her tablet on the rail and pulled up a report that looked like electricity had learned to gossip. On a patient in 512, Kenji, there was a line, 0304 note, pain reassessment 310 after hydromorphone 0.2 milligrams for Escrir, Aranifin. Another on Mrs. Alvarez, 0319, labs drawn, M. Taurus, PBTN. If you tapped them, they blinked and threw an error, referenced object not found, and disappeared as if embarrassed. "Names," Jay said. Bree zoomed like a magician. Escrir, M. Torres. There's a K. Patel on 519. There's a J. Harrow on 523, which is cute because it wants to be you if you were spelled wrong and worked for the night and belonged to no one. She looked up and softened her voice because the job of women in hospitals is to make other women's throats behave. We've had 2 of these in the last quarter. IT called them phantom shifts. The first time it was a storm. The second, it was a planned generator test that overlapped a software patch. The EHR vendor calls it a transient author artifact. Transient author artifact, Jay repeated slowly. Like a nurse with a tattoo who sings and empties Uri meters and apologizes in initials. "You asked if a person can exist and then unsay themselves," Bree said. "This is how I would teach a system to do it badly." The afternoon rolled like old carts, tires that grieved, handles that remembered other hands. The pharmacist came to reconcile narcotics with a tight mouth and left with a looser one because the count was right, which is a romance pharmacists rarely get gifted. The new resident learned to ask Odelia for permission before ordering anything after 1600. Mr. Kenji took a nap that convinced his monitors he wanted a pacemaker. The sky went gray not with weather, but with the hospital's habit of thinking it can make up an afternoon out of fluorescent and grit. At 5, Jay stood alone for 1 minute by the window at the end of the hall and watched the river practice its patient threat. She set her forehead to glass because that's what you do when you are counting backwards out of anger. Behind her, a many-armed pump chimed half-heartedly. She caught her reflection in the glass, badge, tired mouth, and for a half-breath there was someone behind her shoulder, taller by an inch, hair paler than hers, eyes on the corridor, a hand with a raven inked at the wrist reaching to silence the pump with a familiar touch. She turned. The hall was the hall. She did not call security. She wrote a line in her pocket notebook in handwriting that refused to be pretty. Raven wrist. Lefty.
Zgrie lomítko, stores lomítko, patel lomítko je varo.
0300 to 0340. Generator. At shift change, the night team walked off the elevator in ones and twos. People she knew, people she didn't. They looked tired in advance the way you do when the moon is a schedule, not a romance. On the assignment board, the blanks had been filled. Charge, R. McCready. RN, O. Davis/K. Singh/T. Reyes/C. Lot. She looked for a Greer, a Torres. Found none. She walked to the time clock, chronosync, polite blue glow, and watched 2 nurses badge in and check their hair in the reflection out of habit. The screen blinked on its own. For a second, the message flashed in the bottom left corner, too fast to be for anyone. Hello, guest workers. Then it corrected itself. Welcome. Please badge in. Jay stood very still in the corridor that had learned to be decent this afternoon and decided not to go home. Chapter 2, Negative Space. She told no one. Sometimes that is how you get to be useful, by refusing the comfort of a quorum. She texted Cam anyway because it is cowardice not to put a cop in your pocket when the building has elected to tell a story out loud. Staying late to finish charting. Finish it in security, he replied. I have a chair with your name. Instead, she took Bree with her to the basement. Bree objected on principle, and then followed because health information people are drawn to the machinery that claims their souls. The service elevators exhaled the weary breath of rooms that had transported grief for a century and still wished to be praised. They rode down past the loading dock and the laundry, level B2, plant, which always made Jay feel like she had been admitted to a new species. The hall to facilities smelled like metal shaved thin and water that had learned patience. Nagelborn, the IT man, met them outside the generator room as if he had been embarrassed by his own earlier vocabulary and had come to attempt English. He had swapped his badge for a hard hat that did not make him more credible. The automatic transfer switch logs last night show a clean handoff, he said, and handed Jay a printout that looked like a heart monitor after a lecture. 0 dropped packets, 0 alarms. We still saw the EHR spin. I think the interface engine is seeing a duplicate message path when we go to bypass. It's like we're telling it the same thing twice in different voices. It has to choose. At night it chooses the voice that answers quicker. The night voice, Bree said softly, as if she were naming a child. Yeah, he said. And then at shift change, the queues reconcile and anything not blessed by the master loop gets garbage collected. Garbage collected like nurses, Jay said. Data, he said, because that was the flag he had been taught to fly. Bree put a hand out toward the big generator cabinets because she has the vice of touching things. You ever notice, she said, how the plant hum at night feels like a person on the other side of a door learning your breath? Stay behind the yellow, the facilities man called from inside because the yellow tape on the floor was religion in that room. Jay did. She watched the ATS panel blink a polite green and felt nothing but an old, unreasonable dislike for machines that pronounce themselves ready in a font chosen by someone who has never had to apologize to a mother in a hallway. Back upstairs, she made her loop, 501 to 509, 510 to 518, the little S-curves that convince muscle of its use. The night crew worked like the night always works. Voices pitched lower, glances that read monitors like weather, a student nurse bargaining with enforced stand while her preceptor watched, a respiratory therapist who never wore the right size lanyard and therefore always looked like a tourist. Nobody wore a raven tattoo.
Nobody saw.
A nurse she didn't know, Olivia Davis, smiled at her with the politeness of rooms you're not part of and said, "You need anything before you make me nervous." "I'm haunting," Jay said. "Carry on." At 0:59, the overhead lights did their infinitesimal shiver, the imperceptible hiccup the hospital makes when the generator room rehearses the apocalypse. The monitors stayed aloof. The Pyxis cabinets sang their lovely little chime. Door closed. Restock tomorrow. The time clock down the hall flickered and settled. Jay stood in the doorway of 517, where Mrs. Alvarez slept in the committed way of people who have decided to obey a nurse. At 1:03, her phone buzzed. "Cam. Elevator to 50103. No rider. West stairwell door sensor. Open/close X3. Linen cart camera moved 14 inches. She didn't see anyone move the cart. In the nurse's station, the call board chimed twice, tiny and insistent. A room's light went from blue to green on the schematic. The status line on the board logged act. User field blink again. "Olivia?" Oh, Davis was there, had a hand on the console. "Weird," she said, tapping the screen that had never learned to blush. "I didn't touch that." "Ghost charting," said a CNA, attempting to be forgiven. "Or the Q," said Bree, who had materialized with 2 coffees like a priest with water, and handed one to Jay. At 1:11 a.m., phlebotomy cart rolled past the station with nobody pushing it. It was a 6-inch movement, offended by the floor's slight list. It might have been air from an opening door. It might have been the building's old clockwork being remembered by something that had liked being a former world. The custody of ridiculous explanations is one of the hospital's sacraments. They are administered hourly. Jay went to the whiteboard. In the corner, a list of staff names: Olivia Davis, Kieran Singh, Teo Reyes, Celeste Locke. She added, in her tidy, defiant block, Observer, J. Harper. She underlined Harper not because she liked the way it looked, but because Knight had taught her to get her name into rooms before rooms decided names were optional. She took her loop again. In 512, Mr. Kenji breathed with the even punctuation of a man whose pain had been given a number and believed. At the foot of his bed, the pump beeped. "Air in line," that fussy Puritan. Jay reached to silence it and stopped. The button had just depressed half a second before her finger arrived, as if someone else's finger had done the work and stepped away. The little light went from amber to compliant. She looked up at the window. The glass gave back the room's poor idea of itself. In the reflection, for 1/2 beat of a generator's heartbeat, there was another person in the doorway, taller by an inch, pale hair pulled back, head turned slightly toward the pump, a smudge on the wrist where a raven might live if it were ink, and not someone's memory's pet. "Thank you," Jay said to the empty reflection, because manners are cheap and sometimes you tip the universe for not hurting anyone. At 01:30, the elevator chimed without opening its doors. At 1:37, the stairwell door sensor reported open to Cam, and then close, and then fault, and settled on OK, because systems like to pretend stability they haven't earned. At 1:41, the call board logged act on 511 and 514, and then unfroze the user field and showed Escrier, RN, N, too fast for anyone but Jay and Bree to read, then null, then nothing. "Did you see that?" Bree said, excitement and the opposite of thrill wrestling for her mouth. It flashed. "Magelborn's Q," Olivia said, and went to 514 because the monitor in there had decided to hold a small ethical debate about alarm fatigue. They made a plan without voting. Bree to him to capture the audit trail before it fell off the edge of the world. Cam to pull stairwell sensor logs and elevator arrival reports to paper. Jay to put her body between whatever we were calling this and a patient no one had taught to say no to ghosts. At 2:08, the time clock flickered again. Only once, but the message did not hide itself this time. "Hello, guest workers," it said. In the polite lowercase font the vendor had chosen to make the machine seem like part of the family. Olivia saw it and laughed and said, "I feel seen." At 2:10, on the HIM interface engine, Bree's small merciless kingdom, a swarm of HL7 messages queued with sources that made her go still. A 08, update patient information, order control, XO.
Offerfields. Escrir.eren.n. mtores.pbt.n. kapatel.lpen.n. Jotharov.eren.n.
Bree hit print. The printer decided to be analog in a way that honored the building's history and jammed halfway through. She ripped the page with a violence she would apologize to it for later and smoothed what she'd gotten on her knee. At 2:17, Cam texted a still. Stairwell landing, frozen because the encoder hated the world. Contextual data overlaid like an ugly tattoo. Door open, 2 hours, 17 minutes, and 8 seconds motion. NO sensor. Fault reset, 2 hours, 18 minutes, and 1 second. He sent a second still. The same landing, but this time a weird, faint banding across the image like the ghosts of old broadcast TV. A horizontal stripe that made the floor look like it had briefly become water. At 2:23 a.m. nurse call chimes sang from 518. The board did not light. The room did. Jay went because habits are faster than plans. Mrs. Alvarez had her eyes open, calm as someone who has been sat with. The white-haired girl says she'll be back, she said. She forgot the name of the song. What did her badge say? Jay asked, because you keep giving reality a chance to show up with ID. Night, Mrs. Alvarez said, confident as a deacon. At 2:40, Mr. Kenji's pump beeped again, and nobody's finger pressed it before Jay's. She felt obscurely embarrassed to be the only person in the room, like being alone at a fire drill. She silenced it and found her hand shaking, not the open, admirable tremor of adrenaline. The small childish one you get when something refuses to stop being rude in a house you have mocked. At 03:00, the hospital practiced the same trick all over again. The ATS panel in the plant hummed. The generator decided it could take a bow without being asked. The interface engine filled with shadow authors. The time clock flashed hello, guest workers, and the Pixis displayed network delay while opening as smoothly as ever. Bree sent Jay a photo of the queue, a solid column of ghost names, and the same patient MRNs repeating. It's writing over itself, she typed, and then, or writing beside itself and pretending it's the same line. At 3:11, 3:15, 3:17, the linen cart rolled its insubordinate inch toward the door every time someone somewhere breathed too hard. Cam texted elevator, 3 to 5 again, no rider. He added, audio has a hum that isn't HVAC. He wrote, you owe me a coffee that doesn't taste like spines. At 3:19, the stairwell alarm made the polite chirp hospital doors make when they remember to have manners. Jay stepped into the stair door and felt pressure change on her cheek the way a room feels when a person enters it who decides not to announce themselves. She didn't see anyone. She said, you're good, we're covered, because that is what you say to coworkers you haven't learned to be intimate with yet, who have shown they can do the job. The pressure changed back. Somewhere a toilet flushed with a dignity that suggested gravity had not been injured by philosophy. At 3:27, in him, Bree watched 4 ghost notes clear themselves out of the queue, blinking out one by one like stubborn lights forced off in compliance with the code. She put her hand on the printer to feel the vibration of data the way a mechanic feels a car's story through the hood. She thought, wildly, of chapels where people keep candles in red glass in front of a painting because they need the painting to do a job it never applied for, stand between their hunger and their God. At 3:31, Jay's phone buzzed with a text from an ED nurse she didn't particularly like. Did you staff up? We got a transfer out of ICU. Man says a night nurse with a tattoo told him the story about the raven and the moon, and now he trusts the day. And she wrote back, we are fine, and didn't believe herself for a second. At 3:45, when the second hand on the wall clock in 512 trembled over the 9 like a runner refusing to break form, Mr. Kenji woke and said clearly into the room, you're back. And Jay said, I never left. And he said, not you, the one with the song. And then sighed in a way that corrected something in her ribs. At 4 o'clock, the ordinary things reclaimed the ward. Draws were done. Pumps were obedient. The moon made its small white square on the floor by the window and marched it along 2 tiles exactly. Olivia Davis, rope point slept fair in the box the EHR had not yet thought to judge. The night shift began to look towards 6, the long lowing, the sound nurses' bodies make when dawn is a noun began. At 6 o'clock, on the dot, Bree watched the ghost names fall off the queue. They didn't all vanish. They refold into null, and then into the names of day shift people who had never been there at 3:11. She printed what she had, taped the warped low-quality pages to a manila folder as if that could keep them from confessing their nature, and wrote on the tab with a pencil so hard you could hear the letters enter the paper. The missing shift, 5W02/. She left the day blank. People forget how long days are in hospitals. She would fill it in later, when the building told her the truth. At 6:12, the elevator delivered the day team with their hair wet and their shoes patient. The night crew wrote their initials on the NARC count, and the Pixis decided not to throw a fit. The time clock said good morning, as if it meant it. The whiteboard got rewritten with day names and boxy hearts, and a flower someone always draws because flowers own nurses' souls. At 6:25, Cam met Jay under the mezzanine and handed her a printout of door sensor logs with his thumb pressed on the stapled corner like a seal. "It happened," he said, as if they were agreeing to a secret they both wanted to betray. "We can show it happened. We can't show who. That's not nothing." "Not nothing," she said. "Admin will call it a vendor issue," he said. "Facilities will blame the ATS. IT will blame the interface. HR will blame payroll. We will blame the night. Bree will save the queue," Jay said. "Save me a copy," Cam said. "I like my ghosts on paper." At 7:10, when she should have been home with her shoes off and her knees turned toward the part of the couch that forgives, Jay walked into conference B for the day huddle. The nursing supervisor wore a new jacket and an old face. "Still experiencing irregularities with the time system," she said. "We appreciate your patience. If your patients report odd experiences overnight, please be attentive and escalate concerns. Remember, if it's not documented." "Some of us documented," Jay said, and raised her folder like a woman at a town hall. Magelborn, pale from too much generator, watched her with a look that might have been gratitude and might have been the beginning of an alliance. Bree stood in the doorway with 4 copies and a stapler and a mouth that had already written its complaint. Odelia sat with her arms crossed, the way a mother holds a baby you can't see. In the hall outside Conference B, the time clock flickered once, then twice, and then settled. The little polite message in the bottom corner, too fast for anyone on their first cup of coffee to catch, said, "Thank you for your service." Jay did not go home. She put the folder on the charge desk, wrote in the corner in thick black marker, "Do not throw away," and underlined with the same stubbornness that keeps human beings alive in buildings that try to swallow their names. That afternoon she would go to HR and ask for S. Greer's personnel file and be told, gently, that no such person had ever been employed. She would go to the union steward and be told, less gently, that grievances had been filed about in possible ratios at night, and then returned with the note no record of assignments. She would sit with Odelia and say out loud the names the queue had stolen: S. Greer, M. Torres, K. Patel, J. Harrow. She would write them on the corner of the whiteboard behind the medroom telephone and draw a small raven because pettiness is a coat for grief. For now she made another loop. Empty cups in the break room, washed and turned upside down on the towel. A sticker half peeled from a locker in a bank that had too many shoes and not enough lunches. The beds tucked with love as if the night had hands. The elevator chimed. Doors parted on an empty car. The hall took a breath and gave it back. The hospital did what hospitals do, pretended decency had rules, and trusted the people in scrubs to keep the math honest. Jay looked at the window in 512 and watched her reflection decide not to be the only person in the room. She said, softly, in a tone she had learned from nights that loved her, "If you're working, we'll count you." Then she went to pass meds that had already been given, to chart on notes that had been unsaid, to make space on a whiteboard for names that were going to have to learn to insist. Chapter 3, Paper Census. They tried the obvious things first because obvious things deserve their innings. Bree pulled the shadow author report into a daily job and sent a copy to Jay at 6:20, just late enough that people would be tempted to throw it away if she didn't write "do not discard" in pencil so sharp the paper minded her. Cam asked facilities to stop generator tests at night and was told, sweetly, that the code required them between 0100 and 0400 when the utility's load profile made romance with transfer most polite. Odelia wrote the knights' names bigger on the whiteboard and added a small raven in the corner with a dry erase that never fully erases. HR promised a memo. It did not arrive. On Wednesday, Jay brought a book. Not a binder, not a clipboard. The building knows how to lose those. She went to the thrift shop that dressed interns and found an accountant's ledger as long as her forearm. Columns faintly printed, green lines that remembered order. She stamped the first page with the unit stamp, 5 West, because ritual requires noise. At the top she wrote in block letters that would hold in a wind, guest workers, census. Beneath the rule, put your initials / what you did / time from the big clock by the ice machine. Don't mock them with your cleverness, Odelia said, not unkindly, when she saw the title. But do make room for manners. Jay taped a pen to the ledger's spiral with blue painter's tape because blue painter's tape believes in reversible decisions. She set the book in the peculiar corner of the nurse's station that collects unclaimed chapstick and forms that require 3 signatures and the kind of pens nurses steal on their last day. She put a mug there, too, the chipped one that said night, with a napkin folded inside like a pet's blanket. She added a second rule on a small card. Thank you / will count you. Ghosts don't need a time clock, Cam said when she showed him. They need a clerk. Be a gentleman and don't laugh while the clerk is learning to be religious, Jay said. The day went as days do when a knight has chosen to be polite. Weeping at lunch because someone's aunt had decided to do the thing good lungs do, a surgeon whose thick vowels made apologies sound like theology, a tray that did not arrive and 3 that arrived at once. The elevator kept its appointments. The whiteboard learned to write the new patient's nickname because a nurse who likes the taste of honesty had asked. At 23:52, Jay set the ledger open and laid the pen straight across the columns like a bar in a music staff. The station lights had learned how to be dim without acting. Olivia Davis signed in on the time clock. Welcome. Please badge in, and rolled her shoulders like a woman who refuses to let posture be fate. Kiran Singh tucked his hair under a cap, the way men who respect sterile do with an affection that borders on superstition. The elevators coughed up linen, and someone, Teo, dragged a bin with a dignity that made plastic seem like a material the church should learn to bless. At 1 o'clock the lights did their clean hiccup. The ATS panel 2 floors below flirted with bypass, and then married it for 30 seconds, returned to utility with a click polite enough to pass in a chapel. The Pyxis blinked and decided to be generous. The time clock did its trick. Hello, guest workers. Longer this time, as if it had been scolded for talking too fast. The ledger lay open. At 1:06 nothing had written itself. At 1:09 a.m. CNA leaned on the desk to rest her wrists and said, "Do I sign for them?" And Jay said, "No," and felt stupidly like a woman guarding a birdhouse. At 1:12 the pen rolled a quarter turn as if the station had settled in its old bones. At 1:15, when the elevator chimed and did not open, when the call board logged act, with an empty user, a small tremor of graphite traced one short line across the ledger's first column, a trial of pressure, the way a child tests paper before commitment. Olivia, returning from a room where a monitor had decided to become an aria, saw the line and startled, then smoothed her startle with a little laugh because you must treat the uncanny with the same manners you use for priests and dogs. "You want a privacy screen?" she asked the air. She pivoted the ledger a fraction so it faced the corridor where a person going about their work might plan a hand. She moved the pen 1 inch closer to the edge. At 1:17 the pen moved. Not slid, not dragged by air, lifted and set. The motion was contemptuous of theater. The nib came down left of the first column's heading, as if a left hand had taken position. The letters that arrived came fast, upright, nothing coy in them. SG/512. Reassessed pain 3 out of 10 after 0.2. Time 1:16. The hand added a checkmark, a habit medical people share when reality needs simple cosmetics. Nobody breathed for a second, and then the ward exhaled like a kettle. "Welcome," said Odelia softly, in the tone she uses for interns who get the 4 in without bruising. At 119 another line. MT/515, labs. 2 sticks, sorry. The sorry made Bree laugh out loud when Jay texted her a photo, and then cry a little alone in him, because apology is the shape we pour competence into when a vein misbehaves. At 122, KP/518, fully emptied for 150 cc amber. At 126, JH/517, pump air cleared. The Raven. Jay pressed her thumb to the edge of the page to keep from laying her hand on the column. Thank you, she said, because the room had rules now, and one of them was gratitude spoken like a name tag. In 512, Mr. Kenji, awake now without being needy, said, "She wrote it this time." And Jay said, "Yes," and he said, "Then I will sleep as if the world were bendable." The stairwell door sensor reported open and close in a rhythm that had no malice in it, only urgency. The linen cart inched 6 inches in a way that infuriated physics. Bree, sitting cross-legged on a chair in him with her printer behaving for once, hit refresh on the interface queue and watched the shadow authors sign, line by line, into the audit that would in 2 hours insist it had never met them. She printed as they came, Esquire, R, and note, 116, M. Torres, PBT, N, specimen collected, 119, Capitel.lpn, N, intake/output, 122, J. Harrod, R, N, device, 126. At 132, beside the last line, a small drawing appeared for strokes of graphite. A bird, the laziest bird ever drawn, a child's raven, wing like a scythe. Jay took a picture because you must. She did not add her voice to the ledger. She touched the margin with 2 fingers, lightly, the way people touch a pane of glass when the person on the other side might be a friend. "We'll count you," she said again, and the building, which loves repeated sentences more than theology, seemed to learn the shape of it. At 2 o'clock the ATS performed its manners again, less drama this time, as if it, too, had been assigned a preceptor. The ledger accrued 2 more lines. The time clock flashed thank you for too long. The pen sat politely where a left hand would find it. Someone put a cup of water by the book because the body wants what it wants. Nobody drank it. At 2:40, after Olivia had finished flushing a PICC and Kieran had negotiated with a childlike infusion pump, the ledger acquired a different script for the first time. Rounded letters, hesitant, as if a person enused to leaving paper behind had found persuasion. S. Ruth, PRN, cool cloth at neck, 517, dreams quieter. The time, 2:37. That's a living nun, Odelia said, eyes bright. We're allowed to mix our saints. She signs like a woman taught Palmer method, Jay said, and hid her grin when Sister Ruth appeared in the doorway 5 minutes later with 2 more cool cloths and her keys like a rosary. I am not here, Ruth said pleasantly, to be a ghost. I am here to add a rule. She took the little card and added a line in her schoolroom hand. No names without initials. No tasks without time. She set down the cloths. And for God's sake, move that mug out of the traffic. By 3 o'clock the ledger looked like a slim ledger should after an honest hour in a ward. 6 lines, an apology, a drawing that would make children feel brave, a nun's interpolation. The interface Q in him had acquired a shape Bree could defend in court. Author strings, timestamps, message control IDs. Cam had 2 stills from the stairwell camera, with the weird broadcast banding at the exact moments the pen lifted and set. He printed them, annotated with a thick marker, because a man can learn to love proof without becoming insufferable. He wrote, pen down in one corner, and felt for the first time that he was less a guard and more a clerk himself. At 3:17 the night did what nights do when they're tired of kindness. It offered a dare. Something in 518 hiccuped. Mrs. Alvarez's pulse ox, the petty tyrant. The call light did not blink. The board remained smug. The room lighted itself with that dignified sourness hospital fluorescents learn when they've eaten 3 bad afternoons. Jay went because loops are her religion. She found the cord to the oximeter loose in its jack, as if thumb and forefinger had loosened it for a purpose and then been called away, and the numbers flirting with a lie. She reseated the plug. The screen returned to honesty. Mrs. Alvarez did not wake. When she returned to the station, the ledger had a new line, JH/518, reseated SPO 2/317. Then smaller, saw you thanks. JE or JR. The H was sound. The harrow was still the system's joke. The lines, saw you, changed the temperature of the night by a degree. It was nothing. It was enough. At 3:45, the ATS little screen in the bowels of the plant made a contented pixel smile it had not been coded to make. The nurse call board declined to blush again. The time clock kept its banal heart beating. The ledger acquired one last drawing. Another raven, smaller, perched on the downstroke of the J as if auditing the letter. J closed the book gently with a librarian's ridiculous love and taped a second pen to the coil because redundancy is not cynicism, it's care. At 6:05, the day shift arrived to a station that smelled like coffee and paper and humility. J left the ledger propped open with a please read card in a tone no nurse could resist. Odelia made the announcement in huddle and refused to apologize for the tears that didn't arrive. Bree filed the hymn printouts in a manila folder labeled missing shift, paper, and locked a copy in a drawer even the Joint Commission would have called too quaint to be tempting. Administrator eyes narrowed without seeing. Magelborn asked for copies and said quietly to Jay, "I'll shut the purge job at 5:58. We can keep the shadows long enough to show someone who wants the show. Turn it back on at 6:20, Jay said. We're not here to break laws. We're here to write better ones. That afternoon, in HR, a woman with the weaponized haircut kindness sometimes hides behind told Jay there was no S, Greer employed by the hospital in any capacity. There was a Sylvia Greer, she conceded when pressed, scrolling past a 90S, era profile photo where scrubs were the wrong shade of teal. Telemetry nights. Retired in 2001. Had Ganot. Excellent preceptor. Sings to little old men, left-handed. The HR woman's mouth made a small shape like regret and then remembered its orders and returned to neutral. We don't have a forward address. Does anyone? Jay asked. Everyone, the woman said, meaning cemeteries, rivers, a town's memory. In the evening, Tomas, the violinist from the other story, a fragment of the town's richer tapestry. No, keep self-contained. No, wrong. Keep caste consistent. The resident with a grimly hopeful tie came to the desk and read the ledger with the respect interns learn in homes with good tables. You're documenting ghosts, he said. We're documenting work, Jay said. Ghosts are management's problem. The night came again like a contract you only partly want to sign. The ATS rehearsed. The time clock greeted. The ledger waited with its pen. At 1:08, SG/512, Reese. At 1:13, MT/515, Hemolyzed, redrew, sorry. A small drawing of a bandage, square and absurd.
A te godzina 2:02 KP 518, turnet PT od Pilow AT Sacrum.
At 2:14, JH/517, sang two lines, you know. There were no lyrics. There didn't need to be. By Friday, the ledger had a weight to it you could feel when you lifted it. Graphite soaked into paper, fingerprints from hands with sanitizer as a second skin. The impression of letters pressing through to the next page like a relief map of a town learning how to be honest in two alphabets. The Q in him looked like a marching band no one had authorized. Cam had 3 more stills with the broadcast banding, 311, 326, 333, and a report from an elevator tech who said, "There's nothing wrong with your cars. Tell your ghosts to stop playing. Tell your ghosts to unionize," Odelia muttered, and Jay made a note to talk to the steward. It was almost cheerful, which is when hospitals like to throw you something that peels the cheer off your teeth. Saturday at 3:29, the time clock did not say hello, guest workers. It said, in polite lowercase, unauthorized users detected. Please contact admin, and hung there like a door with a chair wedged under the knob. Who changed the message? Bree said, appearing with coffee that tasted like no one for once had indifferenced it. The vendor pushed a patch. Magelborn said over the phone, sounding furious and a little betrayed. New security content. Prevents spoof users from accessing card readers. The ledger lay open. The pen moved once, a brave little hop, and settled. The first line of the night was an apology without a verb, SG, and then, in small letters that had never trembled in their lives until now, blocked. They had 60 seconds to choose whether to be angry or useful. Paper census doesn't need permission, Jay said, and dragged a rolling chair to the station corner as though she were dressing a wound.
Come.
On my way, he said. Facilities can pull the time clock off the network at the floor switch. You didn't hear it from me. Do it, Bree said. We're on paper until sunrise. Magelborn swore once, professionally, and added, I'll pull this unit out of the policy set. You'll be offline maintenance for a night. You'll owe me a cookie. Cupcakes, Odelia said. I bake when I'm angry. The time clock blue-screened with a little whine and went dark, suddenly an appliance instead of a gate. The ledger's pen lifted and set and wrote as if someone had been waiting at a door with their hands full. SG/512, 0.2. MT/515, labels fixed. KP/518, mouth care, mint. She liked it. JH/517, pump. Again. The little raven perched on the J, as if relieved. Cam arrived at the station and set a clipboard down with a flatness that reads as respect. It held a printed sheet that had the peculiar gravity of forms. Manual roll call, 5 West. Columns for initials/task/time. Ice clock/witness. I'll be your witness, he said. If the room needs a union rep with a badge shaped like the wrong god, I'll do it. They made it through the hour without the clock. At 4:06, the building's network decided to forgive them, and the time clock rebooted with a chirp like a bird that prefers captivity. It said hello, then corrected itself to welcome. It did not attempt to be handsome. Bree texted a photo of the interface queue behaving itself despite having been denied its favorite trick. Magelborn texted a thumbs up. He must have practiced in another life. At 4:30, with the ledger full and the coffee pot muttering the language of mercy, Jay did something she had not let herself do all week. She wrote a line for herself. JH/5W. Counted the people who worked. Time, 4:29. In the witness column, Cam wrote C. Solano, blocky as a stamp. Odelia drew a small flower in the margin because flowers own nurses' souls and should own ledgers too. When the sun took the building like a pale absolution, the ledger lay open to the page with the first raven. The ink of their lives dried. The queue sat in him like a cat you don't want but have agreed to feed. The time clock, chastened by sparrows, kept its mouth small. Bree delivered copies of the manual roll call to Risk, to the supervisor, to Magelborn, to herself. We are not documenting ghosts, she said, when the supervisor cleared her throat to try the word in a sentence. We are documenting a night shift. She felt a thrill at her own gall, made a note to ask for a raise. That afternoon, when Jay should have been sleeping, she went to the thrift store again and bought 4 mugs. On each she wrote with a ceramic pen she'd ordered a year ago and never used. SG, MT, KP, JH. She put them on top of the station fridge with their handles facing left. She added a rule to the card. Mugs up, left hands welcome. Sentimental, Odelia said. Superstition is what you call a rule you haven't needed yet, Jay said. On Sunday night, the ledger learned a new hand, a round schoolroom script that might have been a cafeteria worker's or God's aunt. M. Alvarez, thank you for the mint. Time 23:58. The knight nodded and got to work. Chapter 4. Risk and Ritual. They met with Risk on a Tuesday in a conference room with a table too long for the room because some donor's ego had come with legs. A poster on the wall said patient safety is our highest priority in a font that made it feel like a dare. The Risk manager, a neat woman with hair like a rule and a pen that clicked itself when she was anxious, had read the ledger in copies and did not yet believe in clocks. We appreciate your initiative, she said, which in hospital means you have frightened someone with a budget. Any process that involves non-credentialed individuals performing clinical tasks. They're credentialed, Jay said. The credentials are older than your firewall. Risk pressed her lips together as if she were holding hot tea in her mouth and trying not to spit it out. We need to be precise in our language. Good, Bree said. Here is precise language. She slid the audit trail printouts across the table as if she were dealing a hand of cards that could not be cheated. Author strings with time-stamped entries that reconcile with measured physiologies in rooms where day shift can observe a before and after. Here are the manual roll calls, with witness signatures. Here is a signed statement from security regarding stair door alarms and elevator arrivals without riders at times that match the ledger's events. Here are the photos of the time clock behaving like a hired comedian and then, after facility's lawful intervention, behaving like a toaster. Here, and she laid the ledger itself down with a mercy that felt like violence, is paper. You can't purge paper. Risk clicked her pen twice and did the thing well-trained administrators do when someone shows them a simple solution to a shame they are used to disguising. She got smaller for a second and then came back to her height. Even if we accept that there are interventions occurring that are not attributable to scheduled staff, we cannot. She searched for a word that wouldn't get her sued by God. Authorize them. We're not asking you to authorize charity, Odelia said. We're asking you to stop threatening to delete it. There is no deletion, Risk said primly. There was, Magelborn said from the doorway, late by intention so the room would think better of him. He held up a stack of his own, screenshots, system logs, code comments from a vendor support site preserved with the kind of vengeful thoroughness IT people save for Thanksgiving stories. We had a purge job that cleaned transient author artifacts at 5:58 every morning. We got rid of it. The risk manager stared at him as if he'd introduced a raccoon into her kitchen and then expected applause for its salesmanship. You adjusted a vendor's process? I moved it to a manual schedule, he said pleasantly. Per policy, with change control. The policy that would have made that sentence polite didn't exist when you asked your last question. It exists now. He smiled without teeth. Even if I call this a community of practice, Risk said, inventing a euphemism that sounded like a homeschooler's field trip, we cannot build it into policy. You don't have to build it in, Cam said from the corner chair he had taken without asking. You only have to stop kicking the leg of the table every time we set a cup down. We can put it in the downtime procedures, Bree said, reasonable as a road. Manual roll call when the EHR is unavailable or unreliable. Guest workers sign with initials and tasks. A witness signs. Paper is scanned to chart with a manual attest indexer. Clinical leadership reviews at 8 o'clock. Risk reads it and drinks tea. And if the guest workers make a mistake, Risk asked, grasping for an edge she could call hers. Who is accountable? The person who will be accountable is me, Jay said, because there is a point after which you stop bargaining and present your neck. I'm the one who put the book on the desk. I'm the one who wrote counted. If you need a signature you can sue, put mine there. Risk looked down at the ledger where counted appeared in Jay's tidy block and then at Jay's face, which had the sort of calm you learn in rooms where family members are learning a new word for grief. I don't want to sue anyone, she said softly, and sounded human for the first time. I want not to feel like an idiot when my colleagues ask me what the hell we are doing with a manual log for ghosts. Say you are protecting the hospital from a software vendor, Bree said. They will believe you. What do we tell surveyors? Risk asked. The truth, Cam said. That you have a downtime log because your brand new clock doesn't know how to say thank you. Risk clicked her pen one more time, then set it down carefully as if it had been a scalpel. I will not sign off on a policy that uses the word ghost, she said. We won't ask you to, Bree said. We'll use guest workers. Capital G, capital W. Initials only. No names. And no promises, Sister Ruth added, because she had come without announcing her entry and had a way of extracting the last word from rooms that pretended they didn't have one. We will say thank you, and we will say counted, and we will not ask boys to bleed for romance. Who invited? Risk started, then saw the nun's keys and reconsidered theology.
Fine, she said.
Make me a draft by Friday. No birds on it. Okay. Odelia said, already drawing a bird at the bottom margin of her notes. In the hall afterward, Magelborn said to Jay, I looked up Sylvia Greer. HR will tell you she retired in 2001, Jay said.
She did, he said.
And she died in 2004. Stroke. Obituary says she sang. She would have hated the EHR. He put his hand on the mezzanine rail like a man trying to learn how to use his hands for good. You know what else I found? The EHR's training database has a seated user account the vendor uses in their demos, Escreard, RN. It's a fake user with a smiling stock photo and a raven clipped art in the corner of the slide deck. Jay stood very still because the universe had just told a joke and she wanted to make sure she wasn't laughing like a fool. They seeded our system with her name, she said. They seeded every hospital system with someone like her, he said. A smiling ghost in a PowerPoint. We just happened to have the real one. You're telling me we're haunted by a marketing deck, Cam said, appalled and delighted. I'm telling you the door was labeled, Bree said. We didn't build a house. We can decide how to answer. They wrote the policy by Friday. It lived in downtime procedures under a name so boring it could cross any desk without being arrested. Manual overnight intervention log. EHR unavailable or unreliable. It specified initials /task/time. Ice clock /witness. It named guest workers as a courtesy, not an entity. It said NO names without initials and NO tasks without time, and thank you because Sister Ruth had snuck into the document while Bree wasn't looking and taught the bullet points to mind their manners. Risk signed. Administration initialed because Risk had signed. The union steward, who had been waiting 3 weeks for someone to give him a sentence he could carry with dignity, learned it by heart and recited it in a meeting where a CFO tried to pretend he cared about words. Knights behaved. Not perfectly. Pump still decided to be choirs. A family still arrived at 2:18 with a bag of fast food and an exhaustion that made them unkind. The time clock occasionally forgot itself and had to be humbled with the floor switch. The stairwell camera learned to braid its broadcast fans in 3 exactly at 1:16. The ledger filled, the queue filled, and, blessed by Magelborn's new manual purge, stayed. Then, at 8 o'clock, was cleaned by a human hand that left the paper intact. The mug's handles stayed pointed left. The mint mouthwash on the med cart got replaced more often than any charge nurse budgeted for. A young phlebotomist named Marisol Torres, no relation, got extra tips on veins from someone who apologized for hemolyzing and did not appear on the payroll. 2 weeks in, HR put a memo on the internet titled Unauthorized Night Staff Scam Alert and told employees not to let strangers pose as nurses for the purpose of gaining access to Pyxis. We appreciate your vigilance, it said. Odelia printed it and taped it to the inside of the Pyxis door facing inward because she preferred ironies to be private. A month in, a hospital downstate called Bree to ask about a rumor that she was keeping ghosts on salary. We are keeping paper, Bree said. If your EHR wants to play PowerPoint with your dead, we can send you a template. What do you tell families? The woman asked. The truth, Bree said, that we are well staffed. That sometimes at night a nurse with a raven on her wrist sings and empties a Foley, and nobody remembers her at the staff holiday party except the people who count the sheets. In April, at 3:03, the ledger got a line that made Jay stand up too fast and curse her knees. J, Harrow, 517, silenced pump /303. The handwriting was not hers. The letter R kinked differently. The Harrow had an extra downstroke like a person old enough to have learned penmanship with a nun and young enough to resent it. Next to it, a raven so small you wanted a magnifying glass to praise it. You don't have to be me, Jay said to the air, embarrassed at the relief in her mouth. The answer, 2 lines down in the same hand, am not. Then, because the night had a sense of humor. Thank you for the mug. She had written those names on ceramic for herself and for a joke. Somewhere a mouth had found the lip of a cup and felt welcomed by its letters. On a Sunday around dawn when the river wore mist like a scarf, Jay walked into the empty family lounge and found the raven mug on the windowsill with a lip print she recognized by its modesty. She washed it and set it back on the fridge with the handle facing left and knew, as surely as she knew where the pulse oximeter cord liked to work loose, that someone would use it at 1:16 and that it would be no one she could introduce at a potluck. In May, a surveyor from a body that knows how to make grown men cry walked to the unit and paused at the ledger. "What's this?" she said, pencil poised. "Not to report, to copy." Jay told her. The woman's mouth softened into nostalgia. "My first hospital had a prayer book," she said. Except it wasn't prayers. It was names of people who had died that month and one sentence about each. We kept it on the unit because the EHR didn't have a field for kindness. I never thought I'd see anything like it again. She initialed as witness to a line from 214 and did not put it in her report. On an ordinary Tuesday, around 12 minutes after 2, Cam sent a text with a picture of the stairwell landing. No banding, no anomalies, just an empty patch of concrete, and a penny, bright as the inside of a child's cheek, dead center in the frame. He sent a second photo taken from his shoe. The penny had a raven silhouetted on it in the ugly way pennies sometimes get vandalized by novelty machines at state parks. Or perhaps it had been always like that. "Souvenir," he wrote. "Tips accepted," Jay typed back, and set the penny on top of the ledger like a topper. They never got a full name for S, Greer beyond the HR obituary, and the EHR marketing deck. They never got a payroll for M, Torres's careful apology, or K, Patel's obsession with sacral pillows. They never asked J, Harrow, to announce herself from behind a window. They learned to say counted and mean it. They learned thank you without requiring a badge. It was not clean and it was not solved. Some nights the ledger remained blank until a single line at 03. 33 calmed a pump that had been trying to invent its own soul. Some nights the time clock sulked and had to be unplugged like a toddler given the wrong juice. Some nights the stairwell camera ate its own tape, like a snake, unlearning itself. The HR woman with the weaponized haircut rolled her eyes less, but still rolled them. Risk drank tea. Magelborn deleted a purge job every time a vendor update tried to resurrect it, like St. George practiced at the command line. Jay slept on her days off sometimes. She learned to forgive the EHR for being a book written by men who have never wiped a mouth at 212. She learned to touch the ledger with 2 fingers like a well. She learned the song the Raven nurse sang, not by lyrics, which the ledger refused, but by the shape of the silence that followed it, a room that had been told the truth and chose to breathe anyway. In June, on a morning like a windowed hallway, Mr. Kenji went home. He walked to the elevator with a cane that was more argument than furniture. He turned to the station and nodded once to a corner where no one stood. "Thank you, Knight," he said.
I'm counted.
The elevator arrived with no rider, opened on a car with a handprint on the rail that did not belong to anyone on the floor that day. "Census," Odelia whispered as the doors closed, and ticked the little box on the whiteboard with the profound sanctimony only nurses can carry off without being insufferable. The river went about its iron business. The generator practiced good manners and, most nights, kept its vows. The time clock forgot itself sometimes and had to be taught humility. It learned. The ledger fattened into a book you could prop under a short table leg and make the room level. In him, Bree kept a folder with 4 tabs: Hue, Ledger, Risk, Policy, and an index card paperclipped to the front that said in her hand, "Neat and merciless, counted." In the end, the missing shift was not found. It was recognized. Sometimes that is the only victory hospitals permit. Not a cure, but a census. Not a photograph, but a ledger. Not proof, but paper that refuses to be purged. Chapter 5. Change Control. The vendor sent a man who smiled like a patched note. He arrived with a rolling case and a tablet, a polo shirt in a blue so unthreatening it felt curated. His badge said Evernorth Clinical Systems, Field Engineer, and his handshake said I have flown all night and memorized 3 apologies I will not use. He introduced himself as Pierce and called the EHR a platform as if that were a saint's name. Conference B smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner, and the peculiarly sterile Hope administrative rooms exhale. Risk was there with her pen that clicked itself under stress. HR with the haircut that could cut. Nagelborn with code printouts in a folder, like a priest carrying a missal. Bree with the ledger's photocopies and a face trained for patience. Odelia, sitting away from the table, knitting pearl-ridged punishment into a scarf that would later be gifted to a traveler. Cam in the corner, casual as a wall. Jay near the door, because hunters sit where the exits are. We've had overnight anomalies during generator transfer, Pierce said, drawing tidy boxes on a whiteboard. Transient author artifacts. Our audit shows a duplicate queue path spinning up during bypass. We've pushed a content update to suppress orphan transactions and tighten badge reader integration. Your content update told our clock to accuse us of being unauthorized, Bree said, not moving her eyes off her copy of the ledger. We're going to keep the clock unplugged from your feelings between 1 and 4. Pierce smiled more. We're aligned, he said. We love manual downtime procedures. Keeps you resilient. Good, Odelia said. We wrote 1. We named the people who help. His eyes flicked to the ledger, to the column where guest workers, census had been stamped like a decision. He said, recovering smoothly. Cute. Accurate. Cam corrected, friendly as a door that knows when to close. Pierce uncapped a marker and wrote S, Greer in block letters as if invoking a demon by spelling it calmly. Right, he said. So, there is a training persona seeded into our education environment. Sylvia Greer, RN. Stock user. It exists so we can do demos without showing real patient data. It is not present in your production tenant. You put her there, Nagelborn said, bored malevolent. Then you told the interface engine to trust her in a pinch. Impossible, Pierce said reflexively. Then, to his credit, he rephrased. Unlikely. If an orphaned author string arrived in a message, the system would... His hands did a gestural waltz that meant Elsif logic. We'll scrub the training persona from all environments when we build content packs. We'll add a rule. Drop transactions from user's suffix. End during bypass. Don't, Jay said. He turned, and for the first time his smile stuttered.
Pardon?
Don't drop them, she said. Tag them. Hold them. Let us keep what was done, whoever did it, and then we'll sign it. That is the compromise you're going to write in your post-visit report. Risk's pen clicked twice. Pierce looked at Nagelborn. Engineers from opposing houses recognized tribal scars. We could flag, Nagelborn said, shoulders rolling. Set aside ghost notes in a human-reviewed bucket. Him routes them to paper. We attest. The database sleeps at night without lying. Pierce wrote human review queue on the board in letters that wanted to be paid hourly.
Done, he said.
We'll need to file a change order. Do that, Bree said, and slid a manila folder across the table. Here's the template. He laughed once, and then saw she was not kidding and sobered. All right, he said. And the clock message. Hello, guest workers. That's a patch artifact. We removed it. Leave it, Odelia said. It's manners. Manners are out of scope, Pierce said, then, quickly. I'll ask. After, while Risk gathered papers into a pile that might be called a concession when written down later, Pierce caught Jay at the door and lowered his voice to the human register. Do you know her? He asked. The real Greer. No, Jay said, but I can spot her initials from across a room. My mother was Knights, he said, so softly it hardly cleared his teeth. Telemetry.
She sang.
Never charted a poem. He swallowed and straightened and put the smile back on like a badge. We'll write the queue. He left the hospital lighter than he came. Systems that had prepared to be adversaries do that to men. They send them home feeling briefly employed in the right war. Bree's inbox became a place you go when you need a permission nobody wrote. A NICU 2 towns oversent. We have a H. Doyle who suctioned at 217. We don't employ a Doyle. Bree wrote back to keep the note, to count the suction, to sign on paper and turn the clock to the wall. A rehab hospital in the next county road. Our time clock flashed guest workers once, and my charge laughed for 10 minutes and then cried for 2. An old volunteer who knitted baby caps left a voicemail that said, "The lady with white hair put sugar in my tea at 1 a.m. and told me to go home." Bree saved it as evidence of mercy. On Thursdays, the manual cue printouts went to a particular box in him labeled Human Review, Night. Bree checked them at 8 o'clock with a ritual she refused to explain. Hand flat to paper, heart steadied, pen uncapped. She initialed each with a small, readable BK. She taped a penny with a raven to the inside lid for luck. Nagelborn's change order went through in 2 days because he wrote it in the language administration likes, columns and bullets, the word mitigate and the phrase no material impact on throughput, and because Pierce had added a paragraph with a sentence that had never appeared in any vendor's paperwork. Our content previously introduced a training persona, Greer RN, into environments where it could be confused with a clinical identity during transfer. Risk underlined confused twice. HR underlined training and wrote in the margin, never again. Bree wrote counted next to her own name, because she deserved to. The stairwell camera's banding never went away. At 1:16, it braided the image like old broadcast. At 3:03, it stuttered and regained itself. Cam printed the frames and pinned them on a corkboard behind his monitors in a row like rosary beads. He wrote the times underneath with a marker like a man who has agreed to become a clerk for the dead. Nights steadied. The ledger learned 5 new hands, all left-leaning, none dramatic. MT adopted a new affectation, drawing a box around sorry when veins required a second look. KP began noting pillows with the intimate precision of someone who had known bedsores by their first names. SG wrote plain, unshowy lines that read like a woman who would have fired you for sentiment and hugged you in a stairwell when no one could see. JH wrote less. When she did, she kept it without jokes, as if she had decided to become a person rather than a mirror. Once, 517 sang the one about the black bird, but only 2 lines. No lyrics. Jay held the page and felt the room try to draw her into a softer war than the hospital permitted. She set the ledger down like a cup and walked the loop. You can love a ghost only by counting what she does and refusing to ask her for more. In late March, the river thawed and tried the edges of its restraint. The hospital's basement learned a new smell, blooming wet concrete. Facilities laid boards where water licked, the way Sister Ruth had taught a cemetery to behave a few blocks away. The generator practiced dutifully and behaved. The ATS panel displayed its little green okay like a good boy. Jay felt an old, unreasoned dislike soften in her sternum. She bought it a plant. It died. She laughed, and the room felt well. She began sneakingly to look up obituary notices. It felt like cheating on a ledger to read another kind of book. She did it anyway, evenings, shoes off, screen gloving her face. Sylvia Regrier, 1947 to 2004, spouse Michael, predeceased, survived by nieces in 2 states, telemetry RN at St. Edmunds for 30 years. A photograph with hair sprayed into a helmet of decency and an expression that made you sit up straight. The line that mattered to Jay more than it should. She taught 3 generations of nurses how to see monitors as weather, not gods. There was no raven in the picture. Jay imagined one on the wrist, invisible under the cuff. Or on the inside of the name badge, a sticker. Or not at all. Perhaps the bird remembered her instead. You can find a niece, Bree said, dropping into the chair across from Jay in the cafeteria with a tray of food her body would accept as an apology. Or you can let the dead be incorruptible. What do we owe for singing? Jay asked. A cup, Bree said. We owe a cup. They located a niece in a suburb an hour away who sold insurance and owned 3 dogs that did not know their weight. Her name was Maureen. She answered the door with the weaponized kindness of women who know their house looks like a commercial and wish it didn't. When Jay said, "We are calling about your Aunt Sylvia," Maureen's face did a small seismology, pain, surprise, a roll call of rooms, and then settled into a smile that meant I knew she would gossip even from the other side of regulations. She used to hum, Maureen said, bringing out a cookie tin full of photographs and index cards. Never the whole song. She said you only hum the whole thing if you want somebody to keep you. She had a pin she wore on the inside of her cardigan when she wasn't allowed to wear jewelry on the floor. She opened a palm. A cheap metal raven lay in it, black enamel chipped to copper at the wingtip. Jay reached, then stopped herself, then reached again. The bird was cold not with death, but with old purse. Did she write? She asked, feeling silly. Groceries on the back of receipts, Maureen said, and notes to herself.
Check the oil. Keep your mouth.
Salt the water. She smiled. She got in trouble once for writing counted at the top of a census sheet. They told her there was a field for that. She said the field was for the hospital. Counted was for people. Jay put the raven in her pocket, then took it out and set it on the table because pockets are theft and tables are covenants. Can we borrow it? She asked. For the night? Maureen said, bring it back before Sunday dinner or she'll haunt my pantry. They wired the pin to the ledger's spiral with blue tape, left of the column, like a librarian's talisman. The first night it sat there like a joke you hope lands. At 1:12, SG wrote present at the top of the page and drew over the R as if she'd been invited to use a new pen and was testing whether it owned its ink. At 1:17, MT boxed a sorry and left the box slightly crooked in a way that made the word confidence itself. At 2:03, KP wrote mouthed prayer while turning. Don't tell. At 2:14, JH wrote nothing. Sometimes silence is counted. In the morning, Jay drove the raven back to Maureen in a cardboard box it did not need. She set it on the kitchen table and tried to describe the feeling of a ward learning to be held by a hand it couldn't clock. Maureen listened and nodded like a woman cataloging the reasonable mischief of saints. She would have hated being called a ghost, Maureen said, and Jay nearly cried out of relief because she was so tired of that one hungry syllable. She would have said, I'm on my feet. On the first Monday of April, their building ran the mass casualty drill nobody likes. Administrative emails called it coal black in the subject line. Why hospitals named drills like wars, Jay never understood. At 1:30, a recorded voice in security said, this is a drill. Multiple casualties arriving in 10 minutes, and the ED lit itself with that terrible competent light it keeps for holidays and collisions. Or preps, half talented, half grumpy. Knights on the floors looked toward their hall doors, counting rooms that could be made into places to lay someone down. Coal black, Odelia said, pulling the downtime binder like a conjurer's favorite scarf, one part weary, one part ready to teach the building how to be kind on purpose. If administration asks, we did the forms. Who's in charge of counting? Cam asked. You, me, and anyone who noticed the river today. Jay said, get the ledger. Coals roll downhill. Bree said, rolling in a cart with clipboards and the look in her eye that means she intends to own the copier. I'm catching shadows at the door. The generator, excited by theater, did its hiccup too big. The ATS handed off and then thought better of the marriage and handed back with a brief, ungodly stutter. Lights didn't go out. Systems hesitated. Enough. The elevator car stopped between floors and then remembered its chore. The time clock argued with itself, flashed hello, took offense, sulked. The interface queue coughed up a dozen ghost authors in one swallow. The first gurney came through the ED with a simulation victim whose makeup was too enthusiastic. The second came with a real boy from a real car whose seatbelt learned too late and whose mother's mouth taught the ED the grammar of keening. Drills breed invitations. The world sometimes RSVPs rudely. On 5 West, at 2:03, the call board lit 3 rooms at once with ACT, and the ledger collected. SG/512, 0.2 and watch. KP/518, turned with OD, check heels. MT/515, labs before transport. Best vein, right AC. Jay stood at the whiteboard with a dry erase that preferred not to write, tilting it like a divining rod to force ink to behave. She did the math in the margin. 23/28 speds filled. 3 can be made. 1 is a person and not a bed. Do not count him. At 2:10, the overhead paged respiratory stat 2ED in a voice that could not hide it was a drill, and then Dr. Stein, ED in the tone it uses when there is a name attached to an actual body. On her station camera, Bree saw the queue try to purge and Magelborn's manual job hold up a hand. No. She whispered, counted to a screen as if it cared, and then printed lines onto paper to make them decent. At 2:14, The stairwell camera banded into stripes, and the door sensor went from open to fault to okay, like a man confessing then editing himself. Cam caught a shadow at the landing. No body. The sense of a person turning sideways to let a gurney pass anyway. He wrote witnessed presence on his roll call and experienced the peculiar masculinity of deciding to be a clerk rather than a hero. At 2:19, Pierce, Evernorth, texted Magelborn a single line from a hotel near the airport. Watch your cue. Hold. Do not purge. Call me if the clock screams. Magelborn responded with a photograph of the ATS smiling like a boy who had been taught to shake hands and an emoji he had sworn never to use. At 2:22, JH wrote 517, pump, and then added, small, you're okay in a margin. The message was for the room, not the patient. Not everything you write is for the obvious receiver. At 2:30, the ED called up with one live, one mannequin, one family whose grief was having its first public rehearsal and would not be ready for an audience by dawn. 5 West took one. 518th bed got made in 2 minutes by 4 sets of hands, 2 bodies, some of them alive. The ledger collected KP, pillow/sacrum/heels, and SG. Taught student how to do the dignified corner and MT labs before the panic invented itself. JH wrote nothing because her hands were on something that had learned to beep too loud and would be quieted by action better than ink. At 2:44, the time clock, offended by improvisation, bleated unauthorized users detected. Odelia unplugged it like a lamp and put a post-it on its face. SHH. Cam laughed, loudly and kindly, because you must give noise a better job during drills. At 2:57, Risk appeared, hair slightly out of formation, eyes less sharp, pen forgotten. She watched the ledger collect work that was not supposed to be possible and made the face people make when their education meets a town. At 3 o'clock, she pressed the pen onto a line as witness and realized there is a way to be human in a hospital that does not require you to be lovely. She wrote her first initial, small, as if apologizing to her own policies and not needing to. At 3:12, the boy from the car on the gurney stopped trying to be perfect at breathing. The code in the ED was real and disrespectful of the drill's clipboards. Upstairs, a room emptied itself because miracles are sometimes disguised as bed management. MT wrote 248 Courier at ED Bay, took green rack and drew a smiley that looked like a scar. SG wrote 512 OK, till 0, 500. KP wrote 518 turned again. He is not a bed, and underlined, not twice. JH wrote noon for no one and everyone. At 3:26, the ATS panel in the plant did the Hamfist thing. It threw a fault about a neutral that did not matter and then corrected itself, embarrassed. The lights did their quick flicker. The monitor in 517 decided to test the ethics of alarm fatigue. The ledger acquired JH 517 so quickly the graphite line pressed through the paper to scar the page beneath. At 3:33, Sister Ruth walked into the ward without making God take attendance and went to the family lounge and made tea she did not have the authority to make. She wrote in the ledger on her way out, Piarn, cool cloth at necks with a time that lined up against the boy's mother's breath returning to something she could share with the room. Risk saw it and did not object, and later, when she wrote the report, she lied beautifully in the right direction. Community resources contributed supportive measures. At 4:05, the drill declared itself concluded by email and a tone only administrators hear. The real boy was alive. The mannequin experienced a recovery that satisfied the educational objectives. The queue in him sat with its ghost authors gathered like children who had been told the thunder would pass. The ledger lay open. The raven pin winked copper. At 5:58, Magelborn's manual purge job did nothing because a human moved the line on the schedule to 8 o'clock and taped a post-it to his own screen that said "No ampullas." No burrs. No kisses. Purge at 8. He did not know why the phrasing pleased him. He only knew it felt like a policy that could not be sold back to him by even the cleverest vendor. By 6:30, the day crew arrived and took the building as if they had been waiting outside the door listening all night. The drill report later would be a PDF no one read. The ledger was a book with fingerprints you could match to songs. Jay walked to the window at the end of the hall and pressed her forehead to the glass because that is how you lower your temperature without asking a pharmacist. In the reflection, beside her shoulder, for the second beat of a building that had decided to love its people through their stupidest machines, a taller, paler person turned her head just enough to let Jay know she'd gotten what she came for. Jay didn't turn. "We'll count you," she said to glass, to water, to ink, to anyone who could be persuaded to love a ledger. She went to pass meds that had already been given, to initial boxes someone else had drawn, to leave a note for the day charge saying, "If the queue holds, we hold. If the clock forgets, we remember. If anyone asks you who did the work, say we," until they quit wanting a smaller pronoun. Chapter 6. The Night They Tried to Purge Us. It came as an email at 19:08 titled P1, Emergency Content Update. Pierce called Magelborn before it hit the queue. "Corporate's rolling a hard fix," he said without preface. His voice had the flatness of men who know when their own house is about to misbehave. Security content. It deprecates ALD and authors and clears related cues on detection. "It purges," Magelborn said. "It purges," Pierce said. They named it Ghostbuster. "I'm going to commit a felony," Bree said when she heard. "An aesthetically pleasing one." "Change control?" Cam asked, honestly hopeful for once that the paperwork might save them. "They're pushing from their side," Magelborn said. "Lobby to production. We'll get the banner and 30 seconds warning. The content thinks your machine is a city." "Fine," Odelia said, tying her hair back like a woman about to cook for people who have not earned it. "We'll be a town." They wrote a plan on a napkin, because a napkin is a promise you intend to keep while the table is not looking. At banner, facilities kills the floor switch to the time clock and the guest network port the interface engine favors. Him prints the queue. Security screenshots the stairwell timestamps. Charge retrieves the ledger to the med room and writes counted in the margin now, before anyone tells her what the jam wants to be. Sister Ruth will sit in the family lounge with a kettle and a book about rivers and call anyone who looks like they might remember a song by accident. Magelborn will yank the purge job's teeth and put them in his pocket. At 0:59, the overhead lights did their little gasp and resumed. The banner crawled across the EHR like a municipal storm warning. Emergency content update coming online at 1:15. Expect temporary disruptions. Do not adjust your set. Bree printed it and wrote on it in blue ink. "Watch me." At 1:07, Pierce texted Magelborn, "I'm burning a favor. You have a 5-minute window after the push to ring-fence the queue before the purge thread propagates. If you can call it maintenance, do." The text included an emoji that looked like a man praying for a god he no longer believed in to play along. At 1:13, the time clock tried to show hello and received an unplugging like a bedtime. Someone, no one admitted who, taped the raven penny over the corner of its face and wrote "Do not be ugly" in tidy block letters. At 1:15, the push hit. In him, the interface engine did what polite machines do when impolite commands arrive. It made a little bow and then let the new process stand in the line. The thread labeled Ghostbuster flared like a man in an expensive suit clearing his throat. It looked for author strings ending with "n." It opened its mouth. Bree hit pause all on the inbound queue. The button had never been used. It felt sinfully analog. It worked. Messages stacked like obedient cordwood. The screen went gray. In the corner, a warning. Paused by BK at 1 hour 15 minutes and 43 seconds. She smiled and wrote counted on a post-it and stuck it on the bezel for the benefit of no one but the part of herself that likes trophies. Magelborn, 3 floors down, killed the purge job with a command he had rehearsed in his bathroom without the lights on so he would know what his hands were like when it mattered. He added a line to a config file that said, "If process name equals Ghostbuster, then go to /dev/null." It was an ugly joke. He made it neat. He saved the file with trembling fingers and then wiped his palms on his jeans like a boy about to hold a girl's hand for the first time. Security screens in Cam's cave stuttered into broadcast bands at 1:16 on the stairwell. He leaned forward. The door sensor did open fault, okay, like a man trying to atone in the wrong order. He hit print on 3 cameras at once. The printer chewed, objected, acquiesced. He wrote witness under each with a marker thicker than theology. Upstairs, the board on 5 West did not blush. The call lights chimed politely. The pumps held their breath like students in choir trying to please the nun who taught them to sing. The ledger lay open, the raven pin winking copper. Jay wrote counted in the margin hard enough to press a watermark into the next page. At 1:17, a line arrived that felt like a finger tapping the side of a glass to make a waiter turn. SG/512. Reassessed pain. 3 out of 10. The G had a slight flourish like a woman who has allowed herself one indulgence after decades of plain competence. Under it, MT/515 hemolyzed, I swear it's the tubing.
Box sorry.
At 1:18, Ghostbuster in him opened its mouth a second time and found the queue paused. It made a log entry like a child filing a complaint, unable to acquire lock. Bree printed the complaint, initialed it, and put it in a folder labeled compliments. At 1:19, the EHR attempted to help. It did what it always does. It invented friction. Chart note fields lagged. The flow sheets molasted. The tools built to make the night behave when you are alone taught themselves to fight you when you are trying to be more than alone. Paper, Odelia said, and handed Jay a packet of flow sheets that smelled like every nurse's hand.
Pen.
Left mug. At 1:21, KP/518, mouth care, and then parentheses. Mint at med fridge. I won't drink it. Jay smiled like a person whose mouth had remembered its work. At 1:22, JH/517, pump, and then a smaller line under it. Stay, which is not a medical order, and was exactly the right one. At 1:24, Pierce texted window closing and Bree moved. She unpaused the inbound queue for 3 seconds, watched 26 ghost notes flood into her manual bucket like panicked birds, and hit pause again. The GHOSDBUSDER thread snapped at empty air, logged a successful purge of 0 things, congratulated itself, and went to sleep like a man who has decided to call a stalemate a victory. At 1:28, the time clock tried to be helpful and rebooted itself. It blinked to welcome like a child at a door insisting it could be a host. Someone, Odelia, wrote "We live here" in dry erase on its face and patted it as she would a toddler who needed to be offended for order to be restored. At 1:31, Risk appeared, hair out of regulation, blazer unbuttoned, eyes the color of someone who has learned to prefer paper tonight. She said nothing. She sat in the extra chair by the station and put her hand on the ledger the way a mother lightly places a palm on a child's back when the child's sleep has to be downloaded into the room. At 1:37, the stairwell camera banding increased, horizontal stripes like a storm taught to be a barcode. Cam, alone in his cave except for a fan that had been trained by night to pretend it was a river, said out loud, to nobody who could help him, "We've got you." He stapled 3 stills to the roll call. At 1:40, a patient in 514 who had refused every kindness the hospital had invented for women her age, laughed softly in her sleep. In the ledger, SG/514 told her a joke she can't remember now, sorry. The sorry unboxed itself, which made Jay's throat behave inconveniently. At 1:56, the content update declared itself a success. The banner in the EHR declared stability restored. Pierce texted "Did it hurt?" and Magelborn replied with a photograph of the paused queue and a post-it that said no. At 2:03, the plant practiced a transfer because machines love coincidences, and the ATS did the right thing in a way that felt almost like gratitude. At 2:17, Sister Ruth poured tea into paper cups in a lounge that pretended tungsten overhead could be merciful. A husband whose hands did not know where to live held the cup like an assignment and said, "The girl with the bird told me to breathe," and Ruth said, "Do as she says," and added a spare sugar packet to his palm, as if there were sacraments you were allowed to invent. At 2:40, the ledger collected one last line that night in a hand Jay didn't recognize, firm, older, schoolroom writing as if a ruler once corrected it. R. Wiped brow 517. told machine to hush. She thumbed the page, thought of the convent's cool cloths, and did not ask to have theology explained to her. At 4:58, Bree unpaused the queue, let the flood become a river, routed every ghost note into the manual bucket, printed the whole unloved sheaf, and wrote BK0459 at the top in pencil, so the paper would know it belonged to somebody who makes good letters. At 8 o'clock, per policy, she purged the queue with her hand like a priest who puts out candles with her fingers. The ledger did not notice. Paper is arrogant around gods. By noon, the email called P1, Emergency Content Update Success, had been forwarded to executives who wrote Great Work Team. Risk wrote an addendum to the downtime procedure called When the Clock Misbehaves and taped it inside the binder with blue painter's tape because blue tape believes in reversible decisions. Admin did not ask more questions because nothing had broken in a way that cost money. The town kept its shift. That afternoon, Jay carried the ledger to the end of the hall and set it on the sill where the light was most honest. She did not pray. She stood and let the book cool. In the reflection of the window, the taller figure turned its head just so, like a woman checking a pump by habit. Jay didn't turn. "We will keep writing you down," she said. "And if they take the clock, we'll draw one." The glass did not answer. It reflected a woman with a badge and a tired mouth, and a ledger with ink. It reflected cups on a station fridge with handles pointed left. It reflected a stairwell banded like an old television. It reflected a town that had learned to tell the truth at night and then be useful in the morning. Downstairs, Cam pinned 3 stills in a row, 115, 117, 119, and wrote under them in a hand that had taught itself to be reliable. The night they tried to purge US. He underlined US once, because pronouns matter when you are trying to keep a census honest. Upstairs, the clock minded its manners. The river minded its iron. The generator took its bow respectfully and returned to its seat. The ledger fattened by a page. In him, Bree added a new tab to the folder and labeled it with a sentence she wanted on her grave one day, because everything at the hospital teaches you to write your own epitaph before someone else chooses yours. Counted, even when the system forgot. Chapter 7, The Auditor. The email came on a Friday at 15:02, time-stamped with the pettiness of afternoon. State survey. Focused validation. Monday, 9 o'clock. The attachment listed chart numbers, 2 medication pulls, and 1 line that made Risk's pen click 3 times in a row. Concerns re. Overnight activity not attributable to credentialed staff. "They're not calling them ghosts," Bree said, reading over Jay's shoulder. "They're calling them the billing problem." Jay closed the message and looked at the ledger. It sat in its corner with the raven pin wired to the coil, the penny on top, the first page impressed with graphite like relief maps. It seemed, for the first time since they'd put it there, like a witness that might be asked to take the stand and be mocked for its handwriting. "We'll show them paper and policy," Risk said, trying to get ahead of her own breath. "We have the downtime procedure. We have the human review queue. We have manners." The last word escaped without permission. She coughed it back into prose. Monday arrived with the surveyor's shoes. 2 of them, black, sensible, attached to women who wore cardigans that could have doubled as robes of office. The lead introduced herself as Marla Peak, Department of Health. Her partner, younger, carried a tablet and a look that meant she badly wanted to earn whatever it is agencies hand out to star pupils. Peak shook hands like a person who counts pulses by touch. "We've had reports of documentation anomalies," she said. "We're here to observe your overnight controls." They gave her the tour you give the state, not the glossy, not the grim. The thing in between where decency lives. Nagelborn stood in the plant like a docent, explaining automatic transfer switches to people who have never loved a neutral. Bree showed the human review queue and how it fed paper, and how paper refused to blush when corporate tried to name it a bug. Odelia set out the downtime binder like a family Bible. Manual overnight intervention log. EHR unavailable or unreliable. Cam showed stairwell times, elevator arrivals with no riders, the broadcast bands like stripes on a spine. Peak listened the way good clinicians listen, without helping the story reach its conclusion. You built a fence around your night, she said. You wrote a gate and hired a clerk. We hired each other, Odelia said, then colored, because people who spend their lives apologizing do not like hearing they've made something beautiful. The younger surveyor, Sloane, badge-angled, asked the question men and women who like forms ask because the forms pay their rent. What is your control, she said, against falsified entries in this ledger? Who verifies that the initials correspond to tasks actually performed? Cam tapped the witness column with one flat finger. I do, he said. Charge does. Him does. We sign. We don't ask Knight to learn legalese. Who is J. Harrow? Sloane asked, scrolling. We don't have a J. Harrow on staff. She isn't me, Jay said before the room could perform unhelpful theater. She's a joke, the system told us. We didn't laugh. We verified what she wrote and then counted it. Sloane's mouth pursed. So you have an unauthenticated author. We have a book, Bree said evenly. It's the oldest authentication we have left. Peake put up a hand before the room could assign itself to Cam's. We're here tonight, she said. We will be on the unit from 0:30 to 4:30. We will observe your downtime procedure in practice. We will not interfere. We will ask later. Bring sensible shoes, Odelia said. Don't touch the pumps. That Night 5 West behaved like a room that had put on its good sweater. The whiteboard held the census. The mug sat on the fridge with their handles pointed left. The time clock flashed welcome in its bland, helpful lowercase. The stairwell camera banded at 1:16, obligingly. The ATS took its bow without a squeak. The ledger lay open, the pen aligned like a baton. Peake stood at the edge of the station and did not block anyone's path. Sloane hovered near the med room with the curious mixture of deference and judgment bureaucrats, where when they've been told to observe, but have come armed with verbs. Jay looped. Olivia Davis worked. Kieran Singh worked. Celeste Lott ran a kind of kindness, no policy, has found a word for yet. The call board chimed. At 1:12, nothing wrote. At 1:16, the stairwell door reported open and okay. At 1:17, the ledger stayed blank. Sloane's pen poised itself like a beak. At 1:19, Jay's phone vibrated against her scrubs. Cam. 3 to 5, no writer. She looked at the ledger as if it were a patient trying to decide whether she deserved the truth. The pen did not move. By 1:24, 5 tasks had been done. The pump in 5:17, mouth care in 518, labs drawn in 515, pain reassessed in 512, a linen change in 514 because a body had remembered being a river. The ledger stayed quiet. Peake's face did a small shift Jay recognized from old nurses, the look you get when a swallow sticks and you decide to be a throat. She stepped an inch closer to the book and set 2 fingers on its margin. Not enough to claim it, enough to say, the living are not shy. You can write it for them, she said to Jay, not unkind. I don't want to steal their names, Jay said. You're not stealing, Peake said. You're witnessing. Jay picked up the pen. The graphite felt heavier than it had last week. She wrote, SG/512, reassessed March 10th, then paused. The pencil picked up and made a tiny mark, like a bird correcting a human's hand. She moved down. MT/515, labs, 1 stick. The pencil made a shade of a box around sorry. She wrote, KP/518, mouth care mint. Then, below, JH/517, pump. Sloane leaned forward. You're attributing tasks to initials that aren't yours, she said, mouth ready to eject the sentence into a report. I'm copying, Jay said. She put her hand flat to the page, the way Bree does over printouts to teach paper who's responsible. I'm writing down what I saw and what the queue will show and what the rooms will tell you when you ask them in the morning. I'm signing as witness. She wrote in the right-hand column, J. Harper 126, and beneath it, C. Solano, because Cam had slid in from the stairwell, shoulders relaxed, and set his hand to the pen with the relief of a man who has learned to be a clerk and enjoys it. Peake's mouth softened into something like relief. We're not here to erase you, she said. Sloane's pen clicked twice, then stilled. At 1:30, the ledger wrote for itself. A single line, neat, unshowy. Thank you for not making us testify.
No initials.
No time. The pen lay where a left hand could find it. Sloane flinched.
Pete didn't.
We will not make them testify, she said. She looked at Jay. We will ask patience, she added, practical. We will ask whether anyone sang. They worked. The surveyors walked the loop with their hands to themselves and their eyes obedient. At 2:08, the call board logged an act, and Sloane, trained to catch software and lies, saw escreered RN, N flicker, and then self-delete. She caught herself swallowing a sound and wrote the time down like a person deciding to convert. At 3:03, the ATS did its small practice trick. The interface queue paused itself per Bree's hand at 1:15. The ghost authors stacked like hymnals, waiting for a procession. Bree printed them as they arrived, initialed BK, and slid them into the folder labeled Human Review, Night. Sloane watched paper when an argument software had insisted on having a loan. At 3:19, Mrs. Alvarez woke, laughed at nothing, and said to Sloane, who had never been seen before in this building, the white-haired girl forgot the second line again. She does it on purpose. Sloane said, okay, with the humility of a person who has found a new word and is unwilling to say it aloud in case it turns and bites. At 4:11, Peek wrote her initials in the witness column for a single line, Ruth, cool cloths, and that was the moment Jay knew they would not be erased this time. Rules had met their users and found that the night had better handwriting than anyone had accounted for. After dawn, in Conference B, Peek gave them the single bureaucratic blessing a hospital will accept as sacred. We find your downtime procedure adequate and your manual attestation process appropriate, she said. Then, more quietly, to Jay alone at the door, my first job was nights. We kept a prayer list in a drawer because the chart didn't have a field for naming. Don't let them take your drawer. Sloane lingered. I'm supposed to ask for the ledger, she said, cheeks pink with the decency of someone who does not enjoy her orders. Original. For review. You can have copies, Bree said. You can have coffee. You can have the Human Review Q prints. You cannot have the only thing in this hospital that knows how to be a book. Sloane hesitated, then nodded. We'll scan in place, she said, surprising herself. We can cite supervisory control. You can cite manners, Cam said, and even Risk smiled. That afternoon, somebody from corporate compliance sent a separate email whose subject line was pure insult. Internal, potential documentation fraud, J. Harrow. HR frothed, as is their job. Risk sighed and sharpened her pen. Bree attached 4 charts, 3 witness signatures, 6 audit logs, a scan of the page where a note was written under a copied JH, and a single sentence. You are attempting to sue a mirror. She CC'd Peek. The matter went section quiet. At midnight, the stairwell camera did its banding. The time clock said hello, guest workers, for an inking half-second before the vendor's update remembered it had removed that sentence and replaced it with welcome. The ledger lay open. Jay set the pen straight across the columns. It rolled, a quarter turn, to indicate readiness. Count it, she said to the empty hall, and night resumed its habit. Chapter 8, Blackout. The wind came in from the river as if water had remembered air is a cousin and owed a visit. By evening, half the town had glass on the sidewalk like teeth. At 23:40, the lights in the old wing across from 5 West flickered, then held. At 0:06, the street lamps blinked in sequence down Marrow Street, and the dark fell like a coat thrown over a chair. Facilities called a code gray. The plant spooled. The ATS, pleased with its own practice, took the hospital in its hands. The ED cursed politely and rearranged gurneys, or snapped its sterile arrogance into place. 5 West went dim, then steady. The time clock rebooted. The interface queue hiccuped and laid down. The call board glowed like a small town scene from above. Half the grid's down, Cam said over the radio, voice dry, because men who have learned to be useful at night do not get excited at the wrong jobs. We're on generator. City says 4 hours. Make coffee like it's a sacrament, Odelia said. We'll ration lights in rooms without pumps. At 0:30, when the old wing blinked entirely out, their generator leg didn't love those circuits. Down the hallway in 4 East, the emergency lights were doing theater and hating themselves for it. The elevator cars stopped where they were and then decided to be friendly and returned to floors. The EHR sulked. The flow sheets went sticky. The login server complained like a toddler being offered the wrong juice. Downtime. Bree announced on the unit channel. Paper procedures in effect. Manual roll call. Him will run the bucket. Ald and authors flagged. Purge delayed. She sounded like a woman reading a grocery list for a meal she could make in her sleep. The time clock bleated network AUTH failed and then, as if embarrassed by its neediness, shut up. Someone, Celeste, stuck a handwritten sign on it. Hello, guest workers in a child's tidy print. At 1:03 the ATS hiccuped. The generator shifted load to flirt with a second leg. The stairwell camera banded to bars. The call board chimed and logged act in an insulting pale font. The ledger lay open. At 1:05 SG/512, pane 2 out of 10. At 1:07 KP/518, turned, heels. At 1:10 MT/515, labs taken to ED by hand. A small box around sorry with for the jog, not the stick, squeezed into the corner. At 1:12 JH/517, pump and under it in smaller, irreverent letters, you're fine. At 1:16, the ATS did its little bow again because muscle memory is a religion. The old wing stayed dark. A nurse 2 floors down held a flashlight in her teeth and repositioned a woman who deserved better. Sister Ruth moved through the family lounge with a kettle like a lantern and made tea as if the order had been formal. At 1:22, the stairwell door to 5 West decided to be temperamental. The hinge creaked like a complaint. Cam, on his way up with a stack of flashlight batteries, opened it and felt pressure change on his face like heat remembered the shape of a person. He stepped aside with his shoulder against the wall, the way you do when a gurney needs the middle. We've got room, he said to nobody and everyone. The air passed and learned to be hallway again. At 1:30, a real code in 4 East. An old man whose heart had done its job too long rebelled against management. The crash cart's drawer was sticky. The adhesive on the pads had that sleepy refusal it gets in humidity. Jay ran, because many things want from you, but this is the one that gets your feet. In the doorway, she felt, no other word, company. The pads went on smooth. The first shock was not rude. The second brought the old man back to the work of breathing with a dignity that made the intern cry in the hallway for exactly 7 seconds and then wipe his face with the back of his hand and come back in, as if chastened by air. In the ledger later, a single line, SG/4E, held the light. No time.
No witness.
Paper almost refused to take the graphite. The page accepted it like a courtesy. Tell them it was a team. Jay told the intern when the room was quiet and the woman from dietary came because they always come to offer ice. It was, he said, eyes wide, and meant something larger than he could know. At 1:47, a baby in 3 North decided to be born without regard for scheduling. The OB resident sprinted in sneakers, hair under a cap like a promise. In the stairwell between floors, the camera banded and then cleared, and on Cam's monitor the streaks of interference looked briefly like sheets hung on a line. He printed that frame, wrote delivery under it with the precise bashfulness of a man who does not write poetry unless he's threatened. At 2:03, the generator load shifted again. The ATS sang its polite okay, proud, the way a boy is proud of a trick he has finally learned to perform when there are guests. The time clock stayed dark. The ledger fattened.
KP 518. Sacrum intact.
MT/515. Orange juice for sugar 64. No insulin. JH/517. This pump is flirting. At 2:19, the mother of the boy from the drill 2 weeks back came up from the ED to sit in the family lounge and remember how to be a person in a building that will eat you if you let it. Ruth put a cool cloth on her neck and poured tea and said, "Breathe," and the woman did. Afterward, Ruth wrote a line in the ledger, PRN, mothers are counted, and risk, arriving with damp hair and no blazer, initialed as witness, without correcting the spelling of Grace. At 2:33, the EHR, exhausted by behaving, threw a tantrum. Orders refused to route. Notes would not save. The human review queue in him turned into a stack of paper as tall as Bree's elbow. She wrote BK0233 on the top page and kept printing with the stubborn serenity of a woman who can hold a building in her lap if someone would respect that lap's boundaries. The GHOSDBUSDER thread woke up beneath the update and attempted to declare itself. Magelborn's rude little /dev/ null caught it again and turned it into the harmless first syllable of a swear. At 2:45, Mrs. Alvarez's daughter, arriving with a breathless apology and a bag of mints, stopped at the station and said to Jay, "Whoever keeps the mint mouthwash is a saint." And Jay said, "Left-handers appreciate your donation." And the woman nodded as if a sentence had just become a place. At 3:03, the ATS performed like a ballerina for once. No shimmy, no hitch. The stairwell bands widened then narrowed like a breath. On Cam's printed stills, they looked almost like bars on a staff. He wrote sang under the third one and did not explain himself to anyone who might have asked. At 3:11, Mr. Kenji, discharged months ago, texted Jay a photograph from his couch, a raven pin on the lapel of his jacket, a cup of tea, his television showing the news about the blackout. Counted, he wrote. She didn't know how he knew to write the word. She put her phone away and decided to believe the town had learned vocabulary without her. At 3:19, a man in 516 who did not like to be touched let Kiran Singh put a palm lightly at his nape and stayed. That's the verb, ask anyone. The opposite of bolt. In the ledger, KP/assist KS. Hand at nape. Under it, unexpectedly, a small hand different than any blocky learning cursive wrote first time. Celeste Lott looked at the page and whispered, "Good boy," to no one on paper, and went to get a pillow because she knew where the next wrongness lived. At 4:07, the wind dropped as if someone had remembered to close a door. The city's edge lights woke up one by one like old men stretching. The main came back. The generator exhaled its proud breath and handed the building back to utility like a gentleman offering a chair. The ATS screen wrote utility okay and tried to look humble, failed adorably. The time clock rebooted with an indignant welcome. The EHR decided to forgive. It would not soon be forgiven in return. The Q in him fattened and sat for review like a dog that has learned to wait for the command that makes bowls lawful. Bree stacked paper, initialed, BK, wrote counted on the top sheet because she can't help herself, and prepared risks packet. At 6 o'clock, the sun turned the river into a quiet blade. 5 West smelled like coffee and plastic, and one of those human odors that means people have tried all night and did not die. The ledger lay open. The last line of the night was simple, smaller than usual. Few of us tonight. We stayed anyway. Underneath it, in Jay's tidy block as witness, J, Harper 0559. Beside, in Cam's unpretentious hand, C, Solano. Peak, who had stayed past her duty like a nurse does when you aren't watching, added M. Peak and Risk, who had not slept, wrote a small initial and did not apologize for shaking. The day crew took the building with their hair wet and their lists hungry. Odelia wrote the census and drew a raven this time without pretending she hadn't meant to. Magelborn slept in a chair in the plant for 37 minutes, woke with a crick, and reset the purge to 8 o'clock because someone has to do the unglamorous thing every day at the right minute or the ghosts win in the wrong way. At lunch, corporate compliance sent a note. Thanks all for your resilience during the outage. Please remember to document only care provided by credentialed staff. Bree printed it, taped it on the inside of the Pyxis facing and like a confession, wrote "we do" underneath, and closed the door gently so the letter could think about what it had said. That evening, the time clock behaved. The stairwell did its stripes. The ledger opened. The pen lay where a left hand could find it. Jay touched the page and felt, for the first time, something like exhaustion that did not taste like defeat. "We'll count you," she said to Ledger, to Knights, to the people who never get HR emails with their names on them, to the river, to the plant, to paper, to anyone inclined to mistake erasure for order. The night answered the way it prefers, with a neat line, upright, fast, no flourish. Count us 2. Then, as an afterthought, a bird, for strokes, wing like a scythe. The pencil pressed hard enough to scar the page beneath. Chapter 9, The Night Without a Book. They took the ledger in daylight because that is how decent theft is done in hospitals, with a cart, a form, and a smile that says chain of custody. A compliance analyst in a cardigan and the exact right tone, apologetic, inevitable, appeared at 1410 with a barcode tote and a request on letterhead. Original documentation requested for imaging. Odelia argued 3 minutes longer than policy allows before you start accruing enemies. Bree tried scan in place and was told we don't have mobile capacity by a person whose job, in any other industry, would be inventing mobile capacity. Risk wasn't on the floor to see them go. Jay watched the Raven pin disappear under bubble wrap and felt something old and unsentimental lift its head in her chest. "You get me a receipt," she said. The analyst produced one in triplicate with the feckless self-esteem of templated paper. Missing shift ledger, volume 1 in a font that didn't deserve it, a signature line that shook just enough to give Jay a mean hope the woman would learn what her hands were telling her later. At 15:06, the tote rolled toward the elevator. The doors performed the politeness of parting for a thief. The car took the book into a shaft that might as well have been a throat. "Make another," Cam said. "It took us a week to teach them where to find the pen," Jay said. "Teach faster," he said. "Tonight." They improvised with the competence of people who have had to mend hems without needle or thread. Bree cannibalized a binder and 10 packs of ruled paper. Odelia laminated the card with the rules. Initials/task/time, ice clock/witness, and taped it to a baking sheet because metal gets your attention on a station desk. Celeste raided the family lounge and returned with a stack of menu cards, pens by their tails, and a look that said a room can be made to be kind if you turn its furniture the right way. Sister Ruth appeared at the door at dusk with a wooden recipe box that had held apricot cards since 1978. "For tonight," she said, "count with this. It has respect for flour." They wrote guest workers. Temporary census on the first sheet, too large, a little desperate. Odelia taped it to the corner where the old book had sat and placed the 4 left-handed mugs in a line along the back of the desk like votive lamps that happened to hold coffee. At 23:55, the unit felt naked the way you feel walking from bathroom to bedroom with a towel you suddenly dislike. Jay made a loop and hated the absence, as if the ledger were a person with bad timing. "Paper is paper," Bree said, arriving with a USB scanner like a weapon. "Will by God image in place if they make me, when they bring the book back." "When?" Odelia said flatly. At 1 o'clock, the ATS downstairs bowed and resumed. The stairwell camera drew its broadcast stripes. The time clock, unaware of crimes committed in daylight, blinked welcome like a toddler proudly repeating a line. The baking sheet lay ready, with its taped rules. The pen lay where a left hand could find it. At 1:06, nothing moved. At 1:11, the call board registered 2-act, events that refused to pick an author. Jay stood with her hand flat to the paper like a person trying to press a photograph back into the world. "We'll count you," she said into the new book's blank. At 1:13, the pen skittered 2 centimeters and stopped, offended by the baking sheet slickness. "Too shiny," Olivia said, and slid a paper napkin under the first page. "Give them tooth." At 1:15, SG/512, reassess 3 out of 10 arrived in the same unshowy hand, darker, as if the graphite had learned urgency. Below it, MT/515, labs. 1 stick. Sorry with the box around sorry drawn too carefully for MT's usual speed. "Good," Odelia breathed. At 1:17, KP/518, mouth care mint. At 1:19, JH/517, pump. Cam texted, 3 to 5 no rider. Then, door sensor okay. Then, stairwell banding stronger. He sent a still. The bars on the image were thick as a flag. 20 minutes later, Celeste stepped back from 514 with a used basin, wet cloth rolled tight, and the particular set to her mouth that meant the room had been a small battle that didn't get to be called a war. She told me her dream nurse was late, Celeste said. I said late is still counted. At 2:03, Bree's inbox populated with an EHR warning from compliance. Please note, manual log has been temporarily removed for imaging. Do not substitute unauthorized forms. She printed it, taped it inside the Pyxis facing inward, wrote "we won't" beneath it, and closed the door on it like a misbehaving cat. At 2:11, the ATS made its small rehearsal bow. The EHR decided to be sticky on principle. The temporary log accumulated steady, untheatrical lines. The recipe box devoured no cards. Ruth, watching from the lounge with her kettle, registered the shift's new nerve and added a second rule to the laminated sheet with a greased pencil. If the book walks, write on anything. At 2:19, Cam sent, basement Cam. Analyst in records open tote, closed it again. No book inside. Where? Jay started. Magelborn, Bree said. Not in the plant, he replied. Never got the tote. They discovered the book at 2:33 without leaving the floor. It was in 512, on Mr. Kenji's tray table, the raven pin winking copper under lamplight. He was asleep. He'd come back this week with an infection in the stubborn place his body kept for pride. The book was there like a cat that returns to the bed it has always chosen. The baking sheet log had 2 fresh lines not signed in the familiar hands. Brought it back and don't give it to clerks with carts. Blocky, confident, schoolroom script. A third underneath in a smaller, slightly amused hand. We are clerks. Jay did the stupid thing a person does when superstition is not superstition anymore. She touched the cover with 2 fingers and moved the book to the station corner. Tender, not to hide it, but so it would see the pen and recognize the room it preferred. How? Olivia whispered. We'll ask Mrs. Finn, Ruth said, not meaning to be funny and making the hallways snort anyway. She is on good terms with the dead, who are union members. At 2:37, Bree marched the barcode tote back from records like a captured standard and deposited it on the compliance desk with a note that respected neither font nor hierarchy. Ledger scanned in place. Chain of custody. Night. Return receipt attached. See sign in margins. She taped a photocopy of the page where Brought It Back appeared and see seat risk, peak, and, for sport, Pierce. At 3:03, the ATS did its decorous curtsy to utility and back to generator, and the temporary log's pen kept pace with the ledgers without crossing lines. The book seemed to consent to a twin if the twin had manners. At 3:11, the time clock tried welcome again, found it too cheery for a night like this, and politely shut up when Celeste turned it around to face the wall. At 3:19, a nurse new to nights, skin still daytime, stood at the station and stared openly at the ledger while Kieran charted and Odelia dictated and Jay made circles on her report sheet that looked composure to anyone who didn't know her. Is it safe? The new nurse asked. To touch it. It's a book, Odelia said. It won't bite unless you lie. Put your hand down. Say what you did. The nurse wrote, nervous, neat, A. Madrano/CNA/changed linens 514. In the witness column, Cam wrote C. Solano because the right hand likes to leave fingerprints on courage. By 4 o'clock, both pages, the imposter and the original, looked like work. The pen sat where a left hand would expect it. The mugs sat with their handles pointed that way. The recipe box was lighter. The baking sheet card's grease pencil line shone dull and decisive. Write on anything. The room seemed to have learned something, and Jay, who is not mystical, found herself breathing a fraction easier. At 5:12, Risk arrived with her hair down and a look on her face that made it apology to violent intent. She stood at the station and read the temporary log and the ledger together the way a mother reads 2 children's versions of the fight you heard from the yard. She touched the margin where Brought It Back lived and didn't ask who. Scan in place, she said softly. Forever. I will buy the scanner with my own absurd budget. No more carts. Thank you, Bree said, at a volume too small for politics and perfect for deals. At 6 o'clock, the sun found the corners of 5 West, and the book looked unremarkable again. The compliance analyst returned with her tote and a new tone. One you use with a dog that has learned to open the door. We'll image in place, she said, as if inventing the idea, and risk didn't correct her, because sometimes letting someone keep their face is the tax you pay to keep what matters. You'll sign for custody of this, Jay said, more out of muscle memory than malice, and handed the analyst a paper that said night in 3 tidy hands beneath the line-marked witness. The analyst signed and fled. The book stayed. The town learned a rule it had always known: if you want to keep something, put it where it belongs. Chapter 10 Roll Call. They made a ceremony, without calling it one. It began with the clock over the ice machine. Magelborn took it down, replaced it with a new analog face whose second hand didn't twitch like a nervous bird. He labeled it with a Brother P touch: Ice Clock Official. And nobody laughed because labels, in their building, have become sacraments. Peak mailed a letter in actual ink, on paper that had seen better fountains. Your manual attestation process is appropriate. We advise reinforcement of chain of custody practices for physical logs. She added a sentence beneath the signature line in the human script of a person who had preferred paper all along. Don't let them call it a ghost book in your hearing. HR, after 3 weeks of practicing the sentence in a mirror, posted a memo with its ears down. Nights, guest worker log, witness requirements. The bullet points were not graceful, but they were real. Charge or security signature required. Him will image in place. Time from ice clock. No names without initials. No tasks without time. Someone, no one confessed. Added thank you at the bottom in a hand that matched Sister Ruth's. They mounted a shallow case at the station corner. Plexiglass and hinge. 2 brass thumb turns. The ledger lived behind it when nobody was counting, like a book in a church that knows the difference between display and custody. The raven pin stayed wired to the coil with blue tape because replacing it with brass would have made the magic shy. On a Wednesday at 23:58, when paperwork was at its most forgiving and pumps were doing their compliant hum, and the elevators had learned not to practice drama on an even-numbered day, Odelia cleared her throat the way women clear rooms with grace. "We're doing roll," she said, dry, like a teacher whose humor is her students' last state secret. "If you are here, sign." They didn't sign at once. The knight, taught manners, waits for the first hand to ask. SG wrote present at 0:01. The G had the little flourish she'd earned. MT wrote a box around sorry, and then laughed with a pencil, adding for lighting up the lab runner's pager. KP wrote present, and then a private note to herself. Check heels 518, because her concern for Sacra had entered legend and needed no curator. JH wrote here, and drew the smallest bird, yet on the bottom stroke of the H. Then the living signed. O. Davis, RN. K. Singh, RN. C. Lot, CNA. A. Madrano, CNA.
R. MC charge.
C. Solano, security. B. Khosravi, him. A. Magelborn, IT in a hand that betrayed the sin of code. S. Ruth, Piern. J. Harper, RN at the end because a woman who writes counted likes the last line and is permitted it. Any absent? Cam asked, and the room had the indecency to grin. Absent was a word they did not intend to let find purchase. At 1:03, the ATS did its virtuoso little shiver. The stairwell striped. The time clock politely minded its business with its face to the wall. The roll grew a column for work, because attendance without labor is not the math their rooms trust. SG/512, reassessed 3 out of 10. MT/515, labs, 2 sticks, sorry. KP/518, turned, heels, mouth care, mint. JH/517, hump, again, stop flirting. Olivia added 514, linen, dignity corner, and wrote witness in the right-hand column with a flourish she had not earned but might someday. Kieran wrote 516, hand at nape. Cam signed under it, learning the curve of his initials like a man consenting to be proud of his handwriting. At 1:16, the stairwell bands widened until they looked on Cam's screen like sheet music. He'd been writing sang on the prince when that happened, half a joke, half a confession. Tonight, from his chair, he hummed 2 bars. The only part you hum when you don't want someone to keep you, and the monitor, unamused by sentiment, printed the static anyway. He taped it next to the roll and wrote stare. 0116. The new resident, tie badly chosen, heart trying, stepped up to the station around 1:30 and looked at the plexiglass case, as if it contained a relic. May I, he asked. Read, Odelia said. Don't narrate.
He did.
Then, quietly to Jay, my mother worked nights in Fresno. She said the only prayer was census. Then you were raised right, Jay said. Go see 514. She'll teach you her sarcasm. At 2:03, a vent on 4 East threw a tantrum, and a nurse there looked up at the ceiling and said, help, without specifying a god. The ledger would later hold SG/4E, hand on shoulder of the new one. It helped. The human review Q in him held the shadow of the same. Bree printed and initialed. Risk would read it at 8 o'clock with tea, and tell no one she let herself smile. At 2:19, Ruth wrote PRN cool cloths in lounge, and under it, in a half-formed cursive that belonged to none of the usuals, someone wrote thank you very small. Ruth touched the word with one finger and said, you're welcome, not to the book but to a human somewhere whose mouth had remembered how to behave. At 2:33, HR sent another blameless email, reminder. Unauthorized personnel are not permitted to provide clinical care. Bree printed it, taped it face into the Pyxis, wrote we know underneath, and put a peppermint on the shelf to sweeten the letter's prison. At 3:03, the ATS bowed to utility and returned, dancers practicing in a narrow hallway. The roll call lines grew, unshowy, unafraid, SG/512, MT/515, KP/518, JH/517, the living names under them. The witness column, fattening with initials like a small army, was admitting its own existence. At 3:19, Mr. Kenji woke and said, you learned to read, to nobody in particular. Jay, at his side, said, we did. You taught us. He grunted approval and slept again, gloriously uninteresting to any god but the one that keeps men warm. At 3:40, the elevator arrived on 5 with no rider. SG wrote we're here on the roll itself, without bothering to add a task. Cam signed under it as witness, then surprised himself by adding me too in smaller letters, because it seemed right that someone in a shirt with a badge should acknowledge the simplest miracle, presence. At 4:07, the unit grew quiet in that way nights do, when the worst has decided to happen somewhere else, and your rooms have chosen to behave. The ledger sat, the plexiglass reflecting Odelia's hair like a mercy. The mugs on the fridge cooled. The ice clock measured the time it takes for a town to agree not to be missing. At 5:58, out of habit, Magelborn looked at his schedule to make sure the purge was still at 8 and not 5:58, and found he had written on a post-it in his own scratched hand, counted, then purge. He put the post-it in his wallet because an engineer is allowed one superstition per year, and this would be his. At 6 o'clock, the day came with its wet hair decency and its requests that feel like orders and its orders that sound like requests. The roll lay open with a last neat line. Few of us or many. It doesn't matter. We sign. Under it, in living hands, a thicket of initials. In the right column, witness in a dozen versions of the letter W. They didn't ring a bell. They don't get bells. Bells are for chapels and drills. They had a clock and a book and a river outside doing its slow iron cursive. After huddle, the new resident stood at the station, nervous again. What do I do, he asked, when someone tells me a nurse with white hair and a tattoo sang to them at 3. You say thank you, Odelia said. You ask what got done, Bree said. You write it down, Cam said. You initial as witness, Jay said, and slid the plexiglass open for him as easily as a man opens a door for a friend who knows the house. He signed his name small in the margin, A. Stein, MD, then laughed at himself because nobody had asked for doctors. He added witness and made it tidy. That afternoon, Peake's letter arrived by courier because someone on a state payroll had decided to be human. A single sheet, hand-signed, with a second sentence beneath the printed blessing. Keep the roll. One day some administrator will ask you for a metric. Show them handwriting. Jay taped it inside the ledger's cover where the raven pin winked and the penny sat, bright as a coin you refused to spend. That night, when the stairwell banded and the ATS bowed, and the time clock tried another small greeting, and was told it was not the mouth they needed, the roll opened without calling itself sacred. The pen lay where a left hand could find it. The first line arrived, neat and fast, no flourish. SG, present. And then, in a second hand, smaller, stubborn, amused. Counted. Epilogue. Roll kept. By summer, the plexiglass case had fingerprints in the shape of a choir. They called it the roll now, short for guest worker roll, long for the thing you touched before you tell the truth. The brass thumb turn squeaked, on purpose. Odelia said a sacred book ought to complain a little when you open it after midnight. The raven pin stayed wired to the coil with blue painter's tape because new tape would have felt like a lie. The penny with the bird embossed was glued to the inside cover. Cam's idea. Bree said glue is not policy, and then brought better glue. Volume 2 arrived when the first ledger got so fat it started to breathe. The new book had the same green ruling, the same spine that liked to be petted, the same first page stamped with a unit stamp, 5 West, and guest workers, census in Jay's neat block. Underneath, in Sister Ruth's schoolroom hand, NO names without initials, no tasks without time, witness, thank you. Someone, possibly the night itself, added "we're here" in tiny pencil under the last line and drew a bird, so small you had to know what it was to see it. The vendor shipped a quarterly release with a feature Magelborn had quietly authored and Pierce had smuggled into the notes. Human review Q, optional. The bullets made it boring enough to pass through committees. The first sentence made it useful enough to keep. Preserve overnight orphaned author events for manual attestation. Bree printed the note, circled preserve, taped it inside the downtime binder, and wrote counted in the margin because compulsion is sometimes a virtue. HR never apologized and then, one afternoon, did something better. The union steward sent a photo of a laminated card pinned to every unit's board, roll call, nights, with the rules printed in a font that respected how tired people are at 3 o'clock. Someone had added a sticker below the footer, a black bird clipped from a child's craft sheet. Compliance wrote to ask that the sticker be removed. Risk wrote back, 2 words, advisory only. The stickers remained. Maureen came on a Sunday with 3 dogs that could not be persuaded to find their inside voices and a small wooden shadow box. You don't have to keep it forever, she said, setting the raven pin's twin on the desk, black enamel chipped to copper on one wing as if the two had been taught to match. She would have wanted it where the jokes are. Jay wired the second bird next to the first and felt the station grow steadier by a degree. The stairwell camera kept its broadcast bands, thin at 116, thicker during storms. Once in late spring resolved into something that looked unmistakably like a stave of music. Cam wrote sang under that print and, later, in a fit of shyness, wrote sorry beside it, boxed, as if apologizing to the building for enjoying himself on duty. Mr. Kenji left the hospital alive and returned twice. Once for an infection winter deep in him couldn't shake. Once to sit a while in the family lounge and watch the river's pewter surface practice forgiveness. He brought his jacket with the raven pin on the lapel and a thermos of tea and the unearned patience of men who have been counted daily until the last page. When he died, it was not dramatic. A nurse put a palm at his nape and kept it there until his mouth stopped looking for a number to put on pain. In the roll, a single line in a plain hand. Initials nobody knew. K. Counted, window open. Witness. J. Harper S. Ruth. The day's shift did not erase it. Peake mailed a postcard from a different hospital 3 towns over, grainy picture of a lobby fountain, handwriting in blue ink. They have a book now. Called it a downtime log in the binder. Called it a prayer list in the break room. Both are true. Sloan sent a link to a dry announcement. State endorses manual attestation during EHR outages, and, underneath, a 1-word email. Counted. Some nights the roll stayed blank for an hour, and everyone felt superstitious and silly. Some nights SG wrote 3 lines in 10 minutes, and empty box sorry like art. Some nights JH signed only here. Some nights there was a new hand, blocky, careful, A. Madrano/Siene, changed linens, and in the witness column C. Solano steady as a stamp. Some nights, nothing supernatural happened at all, which was the point. The roll taught a room to confess its goodness without needing a ghost to keep it honest. The time clock learned, or pretended to, no more hello, a modest welcome when a new nurse badged in, and a disciplined blankness at 1:16. Someone, Celeste, the likely vandal, taped a tiny sign to its side. Turn TO wall if rude. Everyone obeyed it. The clock behaved. On the last page of Volume 2, before the cardboard made writing petty, Jay wrote a line in black, pen she hoped would survive the copier, the flood, the next administrator who thought paper was quaint. If the clock forgets, we remember. If the system miscounts, we count. If you work in this night, you are on this roll. Underneath it, living hands signed in a tangle. Under that, very small, a penciled word in an unshowy hand that did not need introduction. Counted. The river went on with its iron cursive. The plant hummed in the good key. The stairwell banded. The mugs on the fridge face left, because that's what you do for people who find pens with their left hands at 1:17. The roll stayed where it belonged. Nights kept their names. And when a new nurse asked what to do when a patient said a white-haired girl with a tattoo sang to them at 3, the veterans didn't explain anything complicated or ruin the room with a sermon. They pointed to the plexiglass and said, "Sign."